There were white clouds in the blue sky. Two girls were talking about the events that had happened, smiling. One of them asked if her friend had been there yesterday because it had been incredible. A dark car was moving quickly down the road. The hero asked unhappily if he had really bought his license, and the man rudely replied, telling him to go to hell. A voice asked if that was really what he thought. The young man pressed the phone to his ear and smiled, saying his interlocutor should have seen his face because he was in shock. The hero closed his eyes, saying that he was sure that even if he asked for a raise, he would agree immediately. The young man raised his eyebrows and opened his eyes wide, averting his gaze. He realized that this area was just a hole because homeless people were walking around there. The hero shouted unhappily, asking if he really had to send a photo. He said that his interlocutor was completely insolent and he would hit him for it. A young man with long, dark hair and ragged clothes moved through the crowd. He stopped and clenched his fists, wondering where he was and what kind of foul air that was, the noise from all sides which could make one go deaf. Yomer clenched his fists in the crowd, thinking that this was definitely not the peaceful kingdom he lived in. The hero didn't know where this place was, but it was definitely not an illusion because everything seemed too real. The people around wondered if he was homeless, and a voice asked why the poor guy was standing there. The protagonist thought he needed to find out where he had ended up. Yahello raised his eyebrows and opened his eyes wide, looking ahead. The young man raised his eyebrows, sweat drops running down his forehead. The main characters were in the middle of a busy street, thinking that it was too noisy there. The Emperor of Flames, everyone who called Yahello the Emperor, was condemned to go into a coffin. There were stains in the dark background. Everyone who fought against him had no doubt that he was the Emperor of Flames. The main characters were standing on a mountain of defeated warriors. The hero knew neither mercy nor tears. He appeared in the form of a man, but he hadn't been one for a long time. Yomer emerged from the red water. Behind him was the image of a demon with glowing red eyes. Wherever the hero went, a trail and a scream stretched behind him. No one dared to follow his path because he was nothing but the god of battle. There were footprints in the dark background. The protagonist had defeated the supreme master of the path of darkness, Maram, and forced the leader of the celestial demon cult to kneel. Yomer's red eyes widened as he delivered a blow. The young man was kneeling with his back turned, holding a sharp sword in his hand. For these feats, he was considered the pinnacle of skill among the warriors of light and darkness, which is why he was called the god of martial arts. The young man frowned, averting his gaze. There was a blood mark on his cheek. The protagonist was sitting on top of a rocky cliff, looking at the village below, surrounded by tall green trees. Yomer raised his eyebrows and brought the cup to his mouth. The hero thought that now his past felt like a dream. He believed there couldn't be anything left in his life other than violence. The young man wore a kimono, had a blood-stained sword in his hand, and a dark blood mark in front of him. The voice addressed the man. The girl closed her eyes and smiled widely, asking him to look at that beauty. There were fallen sakura petals on the hem of her kimono. The young man sat at the foot of a tree, saying that he didn't understand. Did she really see beauty in those flower petals? The girl closed her eyes and frowned, asking if he didn't know what joy was. She opened her eyes wide and smiled, looking at the flower in her hand and saying that joy is when you laugh and dance with happiness, even without a special reason. The girl handed the protagonist a bright flower, saying that one day he would probably understand this, but for now she would share her joy with him. The young man carefully examined the flower in his hand. Its petals were a vibrant yellow. The hero thought that meeting that girl melted his heart, and he suddenly learned what tears and laughter were. He imagined images of a smiling girl with long dark hair. Yomer thought about how he never suspected that his life, full of chaos and evil, would someday have joy. The young man thought about how she had found her happiness in life. He wondered what he should do. Maybe he should go in search of happiness or not let himself be carried away by laughter and tears. The hero sat on the edge of a rocky slope, looking ahead, the wind blowing sakura petals from the trees and stirring the protagonist's hair. The young man raised his head and closed his eyes, thinking about what happiness is. The hero's forehead furrowed as sakura petals fell before his face. He wondered if he had achieved eternal immortality. A strong gust of wind swirled the fallen sakura leaves and lifted them above the rocky slope. A whirlwind of pink leaves rose over the stone slopes with the tops of the green trees. Yahello was lying on the ground with his eyes closed. The hero opened his eyes and raised his eyebrows, wondering where he was. Drops of liquid were dripping from the stalactites. The young man was sitting on the ground inside a cave. He turned his surprised gaze away. The protagonist raised his eyebrows, thinking that not long ago he was on the path of immortality. He wondered if someone had cast an illusion on him, and he had noticed. Yahello sat up, looking at the dark corridor ahead of him, thinking that he needed to find a way out of there somehow because he needed to get out and assess the situation. The protagonist froze and opened his eyes wide, and behind him appeared the head of a giant monster with a single eye. The young man frowned in fear and turned around, pink sakura petals flying in the blue sky. Against the backdrop of tall, dilapidated buildings, there was a hot stream of bright red energy. The voice announced that the Alpha group should enter the portal, and if they notice anything suspicious, they should report immediately. Their task was to perform reconnaissance and return alive. The voice wished them good luck. Ahead was a cave with stalactites hanging from the ceiling. The squad of heroes advanced. The young man raised his eyebrows and turned his gaze away, saying that this was a classic portal, but it was strangely silent there. The girl held a bright lantern in her hand and asked if he had really slept during the briefing because the most intelligent monsters lived in classic portals. She frowned, saying that it had been 5 years since the case where the guards of Group 0 had died in a similar situation. A giant cyclops was behind bird-like monsters. The girl said that those people had gone deep into the portal, and their darkness full of monsters awaited them. None of them survived. The bloodied hand of the man was next to the radio, in which a voice asked Group 0 to report the situation. The young man awkwardly raised his eyebrows and scratched his neck, apologizing while the girl frowned, asking everyone not to move. The heroes froze and a loud sound was heard inside the cave, shaking everything around. The girl frowned and looked ahead, thinking that she hadn't even felt its presence, wondering when it appeared. The class of monster had hidden, as if pretending to be dead. The young man opened his eyes wide, asking the commander to look at that. The girl advanced, telling them to fall back. She would hold the monster somehow. The hero extended his hand forward, trying to stop the commander. The girl raised the bright lantern above her head, and in front of her was the body of a giant cyclops with a hole in its chest. She opened her eyes wide and raised her eyebrows in confusion. The loud sound made the cave walls continue to shake. The hero communicated via radio that many bodies of Class A Cyclops and Class B monsters had been discovered inside the cave. The huge body of a cyclops was lying on the ground, its head embedded in the stone wall. The girl approached the hole in its body, saying that all the higher monsters had been killed. They would continue the reconnaissance and she would report when finished. The young man approached, telling the commander that he had already reported this to the center. The girl raised her eyebrows, saying that he was doing well. He raised his eyebrows, asking if it was possible that those monsters had fought among themselves. The commander looked ahead, saying that even if that were the case, the Cyclops couldn't have been hurt like this by lower monsters. The hero guessed that another guild was hunting there because recently guilds had been invading only high-level portals. The girl rubbed her chin thoughtfully, saying that this was interesting. Dust currents spread across the ground as the heroes took a step forward. The commander wondered if there could really be a guild in South Korea that hunted wherever it wanted, and no one knew about it. The protagonist exited the portal amid a bright flow of energy. Yamra frowned and looked ahead, asking where that place was. The young man raised his fist to attack and charged at the Cyclops, leaving behind glowing energy trails. He thought about how, when he opened his eyes, he realized he was in a cave full of monsters. The young man wondered why those monsters, whom he could kill with a single blow, attacked him anyway. The hero hit the giant Cyclops in the stomach, leaving a deep hole in its body. The young man thought about how, somehow, he managed to find an exit. The hero spotted tall buildings in the distance. The ground in front of him was covered in sand. Yamra frowned, asking what kind of ruins those were and if there was still life in them. The young man knelt down, removing clothes from a skeleton. The hero put on a torn t-shirt, thinking about how he was again in an unknown place, surrounded only by dirt, ruins, and time-worn remnants, feeling no sign of life there. Yamra raised his eyebrows in surprise, turning his gaze away. He frowned, thinking that this was the work of wizards. He had already found the celestial demon cult, and their wizards used forbidden magic, something similar to the energy he was feeling now. The hero imagined a hooded man, a bright flow of energy concentrated in his palm. The protagonist frowned and turned his gaze away, gathering beams of light energy in his own palm, thinking he could purify the environment from that magic, but he should observe better before using his power there. The young man turned his gaze away, thinking that first he needed to get out of there. Dark energy flows surrounded his body. His attention was drawn to a tall building in the distance, and he decided to head there since it was the location with the least black energy. Yamra frowned and ran away from the portal with a bright flow of energy, leaving behind intense wind currents. Dark energy flows spread across the sand-covered ground, increasingly emanating from the portal. There was a red sign and unusual lanterns above the entrance of the establishment. A man appeared on the news transmission, and the voice reported that the Korean Awakening Association had not yet made a clear statement about the incident. In America and China, where there are level 0 awakened individuals, discussions about that portal were taking place. The girl sitting at the table raised her hand, asking when the jjajangmyeon would be served. Soyeon smiled, holding a tray with dishes in her hands, saying it was on its way. The girl closed her eyes and smiled, placing the dishes on the table and wishing the heroes a good meal. The cafe door opened slightly, and a young man wearing glasses appeared in the doorway. Soyeon looked at him, saying it had been a while since he last showed up there. Yunho closed his eyes and waved, asking for a plate of jjajangmyeon. The girl approached, saying he looked tired. She asked how he was feeling. The hero sat at the table, asking if she had seen the news today. Another portal had opened in the Deadlands. The guilds were competing for that portal, and they were simply being worn out by the workload, trying to contain the conflict. He imagined the dissatisfied faces of the guild members. Yunho adjusted his glasses, saying they were under enormous pressure. Everyone wanted to get their hands on that portal. They were hunting magic stones, and lately the number of fatalities during the invasions had increased significantly. Santi frowned, holding a tray with a dish in his hand, saying that the portals were multiplying more and more. The young man sighed tiredly, saying that the workload was destroying them. A dish boiled in a pot on the stove. The hero noted that for them, it had its advantages. More magic stones on the market meant a drop in prices. Santi closed his eyes and put his hands on his hips, saying that the monsters didn't make them happy and that the number of customers had declined. Yunho smiled, asking who would dare leave the house at a time like that. A metal suitcase hit the floor. A young man entered the establishment, averted his gaze, and said he couldn't take it anymore. He raised his eyebrows and held out his phone, saying another portal had opened. He just couldn't keep working like that. Santi raised his eyebrows, asking him to calm down and not shout in front of the customers, reminding him that his salary had already been doubled. The young man closed his eyes and looked away, asking if he really thought his life was worth that pittance. He said he couldn't keep working like that. The hero asked for a raise or for them to find another delivery person. Santi extended his hand, asking how he was supposed to do that, given how hard things were for everyone. The young man turned and scratched his ear, asking if he was even being heard, since he was risking his life for that job. Santi smiled and approached Suyun, saying it was time to pick up Haeyoung, and asked if she could do it. The girl looked surprised, saying it wasn't time yet. The young man insisted. Suyun pressed her hand against her chest, saying she understood and would return soon. Santi raised his eyebrows and rubbed his chin thoughtfully, reflecting on how many people were worried about the emergence of new portals. Many feared for their lives, and it had become difficult to find workers. That's why that insolent boy was taking advantage of the situation. He thought about how he had just settled there and didn't want to leave. The hero wondered why he couldn't find a single decent delivery person. The hero looked at the somber young man in front of him. The rays of the bright sun illuminated Imran, who was approaching. The hero frowned, thinking about how everything there was very different from his homeland. Yet there were similarities. Many people had inner energy. The young man was among a crowd of people whose bodies emitted energies of different colors. He noticed a woman and a girl beside her, reflecting on how that girl and her energy stood out from the rest. Shining chains of energy surrounded the girl in a dress with a bunny ear headband on her head. The young man watched the smiling child, reflecting on how pure her energy was. He wondered if that meant the child carried something more within herself. Currents of wind spun green, fallen leaves in the sky. The woman and her daughter approached the crosswalk. The girl opened her eyes wide and smiled. Suyun crouched down, holding the girl's hands. Haeyoung closed her eyes, saying the wind was too strong. A strong gust of wind blew the bunny ear headband off her head. The girl frowned sadly and reached forward. The woman covered one of her eyes, saying it was dangerous to run after it. Haeyoung frowned and reached her hands forward, running toward the fallen headband in the crosswalk, saying her father had given it to her. The girl picked up the accessory and smiled, saying she had recovered it. A large blue car began to brake behind Haeyoung. The girl opened her eyes wide and raised her eyebrows, the headband falling from her hands. Suyun widened her eyes and pressed her hands against her chest. The car was quickly approaching the girl standing in the crosswalk. Suddenly, the protagonist grabbed the girl, saving her from the car. Suyun widened her eyes and pressed her hand against her chest. The little girl raised her eyebrows, looking at the young man. Yeomra held Haeyoung tightly against himself. The girl's mother screamed loudly. The girl looked into the eyes of her savior. The young man held her in his arms, realizing she had almost been run over. The hero asked how she was feeling. Suyun approached, calling out for her daughter. The girl ran to her mother. The woman bowed deeply before the young man, saying she didn't know how she could repay him for saving her daughter. Yeomra said he didn't need anything, but he was happy the girl hadn't been hurt. The hero widened his eyes and looked away. Haeyoung looked at him and smiled. The young man thought about the fact that he had transferred energy to her nervous system, so he believed she would be okay. Suyun asked if she should help him get to the hospital. The young man raised his hand, saying he was fine. The hero's stomach growled loudly. Suyun and Haeyoung widened their eyes. Yeomra lowered his head, trying to remember the last time he had eaten. He recalled himself sitting at the edge of a rocky cliff, eating. The protagonist rubbed his chin thoughtfully, reflecting on how he had only eaten a rice cake before arriving there. The girl turned to the young man and he looked at her. Haeyoung smiled and tugged on his shirt, saying her dad was a cook, so they could go eat together. Suyun closed her eyes and smiled, asking the kind young man not to let them go hungry. After all, he had saved her daughter, so the least they could do is feed him. Yeomra extended his hands, saying he did what he was supposed to, not for a reward, so it wasn't necessary. The protagonist's stomach growled loudly. The little girl laughed, and the young man said he wouldn't refuse such an offer. A red sign and unusual lanterns decorated the cafe entrance. The tables inside were empty. A man shouted, asking if Haeyoung had almost been run over, his eyes and mouth wide open. Santi leaned down to his daughter, asking if she was in pain and if they should go to the hospital. Suyun noticed the girl was fine. She pointed to the young man beside her, saying he had saved Haeyoung and that they decided to feed him, which was why they were there. Santi widened his eyes in surprise, ran to the young man and began shaking his hand gratefully, saying he didn't know how to thank him for saving his daughter and that he could ask for anything he wanted. Haeyeon raised her hand, telling the young man that her dad always said you couldn't sit down dirty. The heroes looked at her in surprise. Yeomra furrowed his brow, looking at his dirty, torn clothes. The man asked if the young man wanted to take a bath while he prepared the food. The protagonist agreed as long as it wasn't too much trouble. The bright sun was beginning to set behind the houses. Sunti handed him a blue t-shirt on a hanger. The young man thanked him. The man smiled, saying he had gained a bit of weight and those clothes no longer fit. Besides, they were about the same height, so they probably fit him. The cafe owner noticed he would also need socks. The young man looked away. Yeomra observed the environment, finding the bathroom walls very bright. He wondered where the well was. The hero turned his attention to the toilet and called the owner. The man raised his head. The protagonist pointed to the toilet, saying the well didn't have enough water. Sunti raised his eyebrows, asking which well he was talking about. Yeomra was reflected in the toilet bowl, explaining that he needed more water because he couldn't wash with so little. The man widened his eyes, saying that wasn't a well but a toilet. The young man turned to him, asking if he really meant to say that was a latrine. Sunti put his hand on his waist, confirming it, as the water was the same as from the faucet, but not for bathing. The man raised his eyebrows and pointed to the shower, explaining he just had to turn the lever for the water to come out. The young man asked if he was doing it right. The shower started writhing from the strong water pressure. The man shouted, telling him to grab it quickly. Yeomra furrowed his brow and covered his face with his hands, asking what kind of snake was that spitting water. Sunti knelt at the bathroom door, saying it was finally over. The protagonist dried his face with a towel, saying he felt good. He thanked the owner. The man turned his head, saying he didn't want to embarrass him, but he wanted to know where he came from, as it seemed like he was seeing a bathroom for the first time. Yeomra furrowed his brow, wondering how he could explain. The man and Suhyun widened their eyes, asking if he had really lost his memory. The protagonist sat at the table next to the girl, saying that only fragments of memory remained, but he couldn't remember how he got there. The man said that explained why the young man was dressed that way. He assumed the cave he came out of was one of the portals. The young man remembered the portal with a bright energy flow. He raised his eyebrows, asking what portals were. The man explained that they were doors to other dimensions, which one day started opening in the world. They still didn't know what they were, as these doors opened and closed for no apparent reason. He imagined the opening of a gate, from which dark streams of energy emerged. Sunti said that sometimes people were sucked into the portals and could only survive alone until the door closed again. Usually, they lost their memory. In severe cases, they completely forgot even basic civilizational skills. He imagined a person being sucked in by glowing energy currents. The man said these people were called the isolated. The protagonist raised his eyebrows. Sun smiled, saying he'd explain it in more detail later, but for now they needed to eat before the food got cold. Yeomra furrowed his brow and gave a sheepish smile, thanking them and asking what it was. He looked at the food on the plate, feeling suspicious about the color of the dish. The hero remembered his hands holding water, associating the food's color with the moment of his initiation. There were fish bodies in the lake, bottles, and other debris scattered on the grass. The young Yeomra fearfully watched his reflection. Above him, a round moon lit up the scene. The hero was in a hole with water, surrounded by people watching him closely. The boy pressed his hands against his face, his eyes shining intensely. To survive, he was forced to drink dirty, stagnant water contaminated with blood and corpses. He had looked at the boy and asked why he wasn't eating, if he didn't like black noodles. The protagonist raised his eyebrows, surprised, asking how one ate those noodles. The girl leaned over to grab the cutlery and explained that he should mix them and twirl them with a fork. He then smiled and handed him the utensil, encouraging him to try it. The man added that before eating, he should say, "Please eat." The young man brought the fork with noodles to his mouth. His eyes widened as he saw glowing streams of energy coming out of the plate. It was jjimyeon. The hero closed his eyes and chewed carefully. Despite the strange appearance, the flavor was excellent, something he had never tasted before. Sunti smiled and scratched his neck, saying he wished he could offer something better, but there was no more food at home. Suhyun smiled, promising they would prepare something tastier next time. The protagonist furrowed his brow and asked for another plate of the same food. He pointed at him, laughing, saying the uncle had gotten dirty again. The man assured him he could eat as much as he wanted. The young man stood at the entrance of the establishment, thanking them for the feast. Sunti looked at him and said there was no need to thank, he could come back anytime he wanted to eat jjimyeon. The hero noticed a piece of paper stuck to the glass and asked what that notice meant. On the cafe window, there was a sign urgently looking for a delivery person, with housing and negotiable salary. At the bottom, there were tear-off strips with the phone number. The man explained they were looking for someone to deliver food. They had other delivery people before, but they all asked for high salaries, so they were urgently in need of someone new. Yeomra pointed at the paper, noting it said there was housing. He asked if that meant they would provide a room for the delivery person. Sunti confirmed, explaining that few people wanted to work in that position. The young man's eyes widened. He thought he needed to settle somewhere since he couldn't return to his world for now, and this was the perfect opportunity. He would work and at the same time learn how this world functioned. The protagonist asked if he could work as their delivery person. Sunti widened his eyes, surprised by his interest. He scratched his head, saying he would be very happy to hire him, but there were legal difficulties in employing an isolated. Suhyun smiled and reached out her hand, reminding them them that the young man had saved Haeum and suggesting they help him. She mentioned that she had heard a citizen could act as a guarantor for an isolated. Sunti raised his eyebrows, uncomfortable. Soo-yoon smiled and hugged her daughter, saying that their meeting was an act of fate. She offered to be the young man's guarantor, allowing him to become the new delivery worker. The man brought his fist to his mouth thinking and acknowledged that she was right, as that kind of solution really existed. He looked at the young man and stated that he would be his guarantor. Yeomra struck his fist into his open palm, thanking them and promising to give his best. He pressed a hand to his chest and introduced himself, saying he was 35 years old. The heroes exclaimed in surprise. Sunti shook his hand, saying they were the same age even though Yeomra looked much younger. Since they were born the same year, they could speak informally with each other. The young man stated that he would work for him. The two shook hands firmly. The little girl suggested calling him Yeomra, smiling and extending her hand. She explained that the name would remind him to smile more often. The protagonist took her hand and smiled, commenting that she wasn't very good at making up names. The girl raised her other hand and smiled, saying she really liked that name because it meant strong smile. Yeomra raised his eyebrows and smiled. He shook her hand and took a step forward, accepting to carry that name. Night had fallen. Many crows perched silently on the wires, until suddenly they began to call loudly. They sensed a powerful magical energy that left them restless. The protagonist was sitting in his room, releasing his power from his chest. When he finished, he slowly opened his eyes. He remained in the lotus position, surrounded by darkness, thinking to himself that this world was filled with pure energy. Yeomra looked around his room, noticing the large number of everyday items these people owned, things he could barely imagine. Looking at the household appliances, he murmured that this was a world of wonders. Suddenly, the sound of the door opening caught his attention. He turned quickly. Sun entered the room and was surprised to see him sitting on the floor, unsure of what to say. Yeomra stood up and wished the man good morning. Sun asked why he was sitting in the dark. The protagonist crossed his arms and replied that he simply hadn't found a lamp, so he just stayed there. The man became even more confused and thought he needed to teach the boy how to turn on the light. Without saying anything, he walked over to the wall and pressed a switch, explaining that all he had to do was press that button for the light to come on. The protagonist widened his eyes, surprised. At that moment, Seyeon entered the room, tying on her apron and wishing Yeomra good morning. The protagonist turned to her and asked if she was already heading to the kitchen to cook. Sun, fiddling with the kitchen counter, replied that not yet, but they were opening the place, so there was a lot of work to do. Seyeon approached her husband and the two began talking to each other. Yeomra, sitting at the table, watched them. After a few seconds, he lifted his head and asked if he could help. Sun looked at him and asked if he really wanted help, saying he could still sleep a little longer. He added that he felt bad, making him work more than necessary. Yeomra extended his hand and said he just wanted to repay their kindness. Sun grabbed a frying pan and walked over to him, asking if he could help with the cleaning. He handed him a vacuum cleaner and explained that the device made cleaning easier. Watching the young man hold the vacuum awkwardly, Sun explained that he just needed to press a button for it to suck up dust and dirt, and that he should move it across the floor like a mop. The protagonist turned on the device but accidentally got his long hair sucked into the machine. Sun turned with a smile on his face, saying that his daughter also sometimes helped with cleaning, but when he looked at Yeomra, he screamed in fright. The protagonist's hair was flying everywhere, his face expressed pure shock. Sun sighed deeply and said that although the vacuum was old, its suction was strong, so one had to be careful. Sweating, he asked if the boy could handle it. Without receiving a response, he went to the kitchen, saying he needed to work and would leave the cleaning to him. The protagonist accepted this while holding the vacuum cleaner. Bringing the device closer to himself, he murmured that he needed to clean, but that contraption was dangerous. Suddenly, his eyes sparkled. He wondered whether he should use magic. With that thought, he raised his hand, which was immediately enveloped in magical energy. Clenching his fist, he focused. Then he lifted his hand, releasing his power in the form of a gust of wind. His eyes glowed intensely as he increased the wind's strength, gathering all the dust and dirt in the apartment up to the ceiling. Then, with a swift hand motion, he condensed all the dirt into a single compact pile. With one final gesture, he launched the trash directly into the bin. The protagonist looked ahead, satisfied, thinking that the dust and dirt had been removed. Now he needed to continue cleaning. Yeomra raised his hand and made the water from the bucket float in the air. The liquid wrapped around his hand and glowed brightly. Clenching his fist, he began washing the whole room quickly. Raising his hand upward, he cleaned the ceiling all at once. With narrowed eyes, he analyzed the result. Placing his hand on his waist, he affirmed to himself that he had done a good job. Sun entered the room, calling for the boy. The protagonist extended his hand forward and explained that he had cleaned in his own way. Then he asked what the man thought. Furious, Sun shouted, asking if that was Yeomra's ability. The boy confirmed, asking if he meant his control over the water element. Upon the affirmative response, Sun pointed a finger at him, incredulous, asking if he really was a high-level awakened. The protagonist furrowed his brow and asked what an awakened was. After After a brief silence, Sun explained that this was the name given to people who develop superpowers. He said this phenomenon began 25 years ago when the portals started to open. He went on to say that these abilities were called aura, and that the awakened could possess telekinesis and various types of elemental magic. He explained that depending on one's control over the aura, each individual was assigned a class. The higher the class, the greater the status and influence in society. A drop of sweat ran down his face as he commented that when he worked as a porter, there were awakened among his colleagues, but he had never seen anyone with such refined control of aura as Yahello. Clenching his fist, Sun stated that talents like that shouldn't be wasted in a restaurant. He said the protagonist should become a hunter in a guild. That way he could live a dignified life. Yahello lowered his head, letting his hair cover his face. In a firm tone, he stated that he had no intention of becoming a hunter. Sun shouted in outrage, saying that the boy simply didn't remember what life in that country was like. High-level awakened lived like nobles. The protagonist approached him and declared that after hearing that, his desire to become a hunter had diminished even more. Clenching his fist, he said that he had already experienced both wealth and glory, but realized too late that all of it was fleeting. Sun spread his arms, asking if Yahello was beginning to recover his memory. Lowering his gaze, the protagonist denied it, explaining that his previous life was in a completely different world. He revealed that one day he fell into oblivion and woke up inside one of the portals Sun had spoken of. He managed to escape and reach the city as he was searching for pure energy. He remembered the moment he saved Han, who was nearly run over by an iron carriage. Sun looked at him awkwardly. Yahello furrowed his brow and apologized, saying he hadn't meant to deceive the man and should have told the truth from the start. He scratched his shoulder, confused, and then looked away. With tears in his eyes, Sun said that the boy had gone through a lot and must have felt afraid to find himself alone in an unknown world. The protagonist asked if he truly believed him. Sun placed his hands on the boy's shoulders and replied that if he were in his place, he wouldn't have been able to tell everything right away either. He suggested that as a precaution, Yahello identify himself as an isolationist and consider taking the superpower test. He said that afterward, his life could change for the better. At the Department of Awakened Support, 1st Division, a young man was sleeping at his desk, his head resting on the computer keyboard. A girl entered the office and called out loudly for Jinho. The young man woke up with a start, adjusting his glasses. She looked at him and asked if he had really spent the whole night working again, saying that at this rate, he would die from exhaustion. Jinho scratched the back of his neck and asked why they had received money. The girl crossed her arms and asked what was going on that had made him work all night. Stretching, Jinho replied that it was because of number 128,109. He had no idea where to even begin. The girl handed him some papers, telling him to just accept them. She knew Jinho was still looking for that class 0 awakened. Jinho adjusted his glasses, confused as he looked at the paper. The number he had mentioned was written there. The girl repeated that the president had ordered the case to be closed. While the young man analyzed the documents, she reaffirmed that case 128,109 had been officially closed by direct order. Upon hearing this, Jinho asked, displeased, if they really didn't want to find the class 0 awakened. On impulse, he threw the papers hard on the table, held his head, and shouted, asking how that was possible. Munchai looked at his colleague and replied that it was the president's order. Jinho pressed his temples hard and said that for the first time in history, his country had the chance to find its own class 0 awakened. The girl hesitated and commented that if they continued the investigation, they still hadn't found that person. If they found this awakened one, Korea would finally take its place among the allied nations. Noonga listened to everything and hesitantly asked what would happen if they searched, but never managed to capture him. Crossing his arms, Jinho firmly replied that there was no reason to be afraid because they would definitely find him. The girl agreed, saying it was true because he couldn't be stopped. Waving her hand, she stated she would handle things with the president, allowing Jinho to conduct his investigation as quickly as possible. The young man jumped out of his chair and thanked her. Then he asked if she really was going out for business and what would happen to lunch. The girl stopped and replied that she had a meeting. She added that she would have lunch with her younger brother since it had been a long time since they had seen each other. As Jinho put on his coat, he remembered that her brother was a paramedic named Kim from the medical unit. Noonga suggested that if he hadn't had lunch yet, he could join them. Adjusting his sleeves, he declined, saying that this time he'd buy something at the store and eat right there. Then he asked what Noonga would eat. The girl shrugged, saying she didn't know yet. Putting her hand on her face, she thoughtfully commented that her brother had mentioned a famous restaurant nearby, but she hadn't asked what kind of food it was. Jinho said he could guess. He added that at least he knew which place the department head, Yunho, would recommend. Adjusting his tie, he asked if his colleague didn't know that the chief was a great food enthusiast. Money crossed her arms and replied that her brother had also said the chief had recommended that restaurant to him. Surprised, Jinho looked at her and commented that in that case, it was probably Yunho's favorite place. What was the name of the restaurant? The sign read, Spring Pavilion. Money stopped in front of the sign and stared at it for a moment. A few minutes later, her brother approached, saying he had wanted to have lunch with her there for a long time because the jjajangmyeon was simply amazing. Really? Asked the girl, her voice confused. Seeing her reaction, the young man raised his hand to his face and asked if his sister really didn't like jjajangmyeon. Manhwa placed her hand on her brother's shoulder and assured him that she was there to have lunch with him, so how could she not like it? Smiling, she said she loved jjajangmyeon, but in her mind she thought that she wanted to take him to a fancy restaurant at least once, not always to places like that. After thinking for a moment, she stepped forward and declared that she was very hungry. As she entered, she looked at her brother and commented that she was curious about the restaurant recommended by the department head. She said the food must be very good since he liked it so much. Good afternoon, a warm and gentle female voice was heard. Manhwa turned and was shocked. There was no one inside, so Yoon looked at the first customers and asked them to take a seat. She didn't take her eyes off the guys, saying it was a self-service restaurant, so they should follow her. Hearing that, Manhwa got confused and responded, "All right." The girl handed them the menu and asked them to call her when they had decided on their order. Manhwa asked if that was a good restaurant and why it was so empty, to which Myunjin smiled and asked her to stop, since he knew the food there was very delicious. He handed the menu to his sister and said he was sure she would like it. After that, the girl asked if he had already decided. The young man answered with a smile that he would order jjajangmyeon, and Manhwa said, confused, that she would try it too. Myunjin raised his hand and called the waitress. The girl approached for the notepad and asked if they were ready to order. The young man asked for 1 portion of sweet and sour pork. After that, he winked at the girl and called her madam, then ordered 2 more portions of jjajangmyeon, to which Manhwa was very surprised and spit out her water. The waitress covered her face with her hands, embarrassed, and said she would also include a portion of dumplings on the house. Manhwa looked at him with an ironic smile and said her brother had become very sociable, to which the young man replied it was just basic manners. Myunjin looked at his sister and asked how she was doing overall, since they were probably in a rush because of the Eclipse portal incident. Manhwa helped herself to a glass of water and said that a headache was the least of her problems after that incident, and her brother asked her to tell him about it. The girl took a sip of water and said that the incident had drawn a lot of attention, and if they didn't find the only Class O awakened in many years, and their association would never recover from the blow to its reputation, and the president had ordered the case closed. She asked if Myunjin remembered her colleague, Jin-ho from the support department, since he swore he would find the awakened by any means necessary. Myunjin smiled awkwardly and said it clearly wasn't easy for his sister at that time. She said the easiest way was to close the case, but how could she miss such an opportunity, since she and Jin-ho were making life harder for themselves? Suddenly, the girl felt a strange sensation on her back and widened her eyes. With red eyes, she turned abruptly. Myunjin looked at his sister with concern and asked what had happened. At a distant table, he saw a suspicious man. She sat and stared at him, feeling an incredibly powerful aura coming from him. She kept observing him and wondered why she hadn't sensed anything until now. After all, there had been an aura outburst just moments ago. The girl furrowed her brow and thought that her aura detection ability had worked on him, but in a second, a terrible force emanated from the young man. But had he really managed to hide his aura so quickly? A drop of sweat appeared on her face as she reasoned that, if she wasn't mistaken, the protagonist was at least Class A, but his level could be comparable to the Class O awakened they were looking for. Suddenly, the waitress arrived at the table and brought the food, smiling as she announced the young man's order. She placed the dishes and wished them a good meal, to which Myunjin thanked her and told his sister to look that beauty. Manhwa looked up at her brother, confused. He remembered Sunt telling him that the city was dangerous to live in because it was full of monsters, and then asked why people didn't just leave. Sunt crossed his arms and replied that the city was dangerous, but not to the point where people were willing to abandon their homes. 25 years ago, Sunt said that back then, the first monsters appeared and it was impossible to live in the city. He explained that people soon realized that with the help of magical stones, protective barriers could be created around cities, so their city was relatively safe. Yamra immediately asked what kind of magical stones those were. Sunt smiled and replied that they were something like the cores people found inside the bodies of dead monsters. The stones contained so much energy that they began to replace old energy sources, and thanks to them, there was a leap in scientific development. He put his hands in his pockets and said that didn't mean the streets were completely safe, so they still needed to be careful. Then he suggested a break, grabbed a can of soda, and opened it skillfully. Smiling, he held it out to the protagonist and asked if he wanted to drink it. Yomer stepped back upon hearing the sound of the can opening and asked fearfully what that was. Sunt laughed and insisted he try it, certain that the protagonist had never tasted anything like it. Yomer took the can and looked at it suspiciously, thinking he was afraid to try it, but on the other hand, he had also been hesitant when eating jjajangmyeon for the first time, so he gathered his courage and took a sip, curious about the taste. It was as if an electric shock ran through his body, making him glow. He felt the sweet spiciness was refreshing and spread inside him, similar to the enlightenment that takes hold of a person like a lightning bolt after long and arduous training. Yomer frowned and squeezed the can tightly, finding the drink strange. Looking at the can, he thought that not not even the magical panacea of the elders from the Ice Palace could compare to that feeling, and then let out a grunt. Sunt watched him with a smile and asked if the protagonist was surprised. He patted his belly and commented that the drink also helped with digestion, which surprised Yamra, who shouted that it was amazing. Sunt walked back to the motorcycle and said they needed to return, as they had rested enough. Yamra extended his hand and asked if he really had to use that device, after which the man repeated the question. The protagonist insisted, asking if it was possible to make deliveries without a motorcycle, to which Sunt replied, confused, that certainly there were other means of transport, but nothing was better for a deliveryman than a bike. The young man declared that he could manage just fine with his own legs. Sunt opened his mouth in surprise and shouted loudly. He began gesturing energetically with his hands and exclaimed that the delivery had to be fast. Otherwise, the noodles would swell on the way and the dish would lose its presentation. Moreover, the customers would get angry about the delay, to which Yamra looked at him coldly and replied that there was no need to worry about that. Pointing to himself with his thumb, he added that with his own legs, he was faster than a motorcycle. Sunt screamed, asking how that was possible. Then he thought maybe it wasn't so absurd after all. He crossed his arms and figured the boy was an awakened one, apparently from a high class. Yamra stated that if the man didn't believe him, then he would show him everything on the way back. Sunt looked at him and said fine. He got on the motorcycle and asked if the protagonist remembered the way back to the restaurant, to which he nodded. Sunt stared at him and said that he certainly believed him, but to be sure, they should test it, then ordered him to run. Adjusting his helmet, he added that he was setting off. He started the motorcycle and declared that if Yamra really passed him, then he would approve deliveries without a vehicle for him. Then he accelerated and shouted that it was time to begin. Yamra was nicknamed the Flame Emperor for a reason. He possessed an incredible gift for the fire element called the invisible body technique. As the name suggested, when using this ability, he became completely invisible, able to approach the enemy undetected and eliminate them. After attaining enlightenment, the protagonist continued to refine his invisible body technique. He named the enhanced version of this technique the Void Invisible Body Technique. He flew past the company's awake employees at such a high speed that no one even noticed his presence. He ran ahead, cloaked in magical power. This ability not only made him invisible, but also rendered his existence undetectable. Additionally, it boosted his agility and speed to incredible levels. This new technique, combined with his supreme mastery of martial arts, earned him the title of God of Martial Arts, an even more majestic title than the God of Death. A few minutes passed and Sunti arrived at the restaurant on his motorcycle. He stopped, got off the vehicle, removed his helmet, and let out a long sigh before asking where the protagonist was. He walked to the door of the establishment and, in his mind, thought he had gone all out, treating it like a competition. As soon as he opened the door, he was struck by shock. In front of him were his family and the protagonist, who had hands sitting on his shoulders. The man looked at the protagonist, surprised, and shouted, asking if he had really arrived before him. But when? His wife laughed and said he had arrived 10 minutes ago. Sunti looked at his beloved and, confused, repeated the number in a low voice. After calming down, he approached the young man and declared that, as promised, he would allow him to make deliveries without a vehicle. Suddenly, he reminded him about the superpower test. Upon hearing this, Yamra was surprised. Suddenly, Sunti exclaimed enthusiastically that he simply had to take the test because he was very curious about his class. The protagonist let out a deep sigh and said he would take the test. Time passed. A skyscraper towered imposingly into the sky. In front of its entrance stood the protagonist and Sunti. The man placed his hands on his hips and loudly proclaimed that they had finally arrived. In his mind, he told himself, confused, that he had managed to convince him to take the test. At that moment, Yamra looked around and commented that there were many people there. However, as a citizen without documentation who had emerged from the portal, he would have to go through several procedures. They sat at one of the service counters where the staff asked the protagonist to fill out a form. He looked at the paper and asked what he should write, since he had no documents or registration. Sunti pointed to one of the lines, the one for the surname, and said he should write anything there, and for the address field, he should write the restaurant's address. The bureaucracy dragged on for a few more days. When they finally left the building, Sunti clenched his fists and thought he was exhausted from all that senseless paperwork pushing, but he needed to finish everything because Yamra was their savior. Suddenly, the protagonist turned to him. The man looked back, surprised, and Yamra asked how exactly the test was conducted. Sunti extended his hand and explained that during the exam, he would have to place his hands on two spheres slightly larger than a fist, through which an electric current would flow. Pointing his finger, he detailed that the stronger the electric shock felt, the lower the level. However, if he withstood the current well, it meant he was of a high level. In other words, those with a high level had great energy potential. Yamra asked if having a high class was a good thing. Sunti replied that with a high class, his life would drastically change for the better, and that some exceptionally talented individuals were considered national treasures. He placed his hand on his chin and added that a high level guaranteed a comfortable existence. The protagonist looked ahead indifferently and thought that anyone in his place would be jumping for joy. But he knew better than anyone that wealth and fame were nothing but dust and ashes. He reflected that human desires and passions were insatiable, and that no matter how hard one tried, a lifetime would not be enough to satisfy them. He remembered how he had grown tired of this world full of ambition and decided to isolate himself in a remote village in the mountains. He knew he could not allow his peace to be disturbed again. Lifting his head, he observed the skyscraper and concluded that from that moment on, he would need to hide his true level. Then he told Sunti he was going. The man waved at him and wished him good luck. The protagonist stopped abruptly and pressed his lips together. Turning around, he called out to Sunti. The man, confused, asked in which room the test was being held. Inside the elevator, the protagonist suddenly heard the announcement that he had reached the second floor and that the doors were opening. He began to look around, intrigued, thinking it was an autonomous box that even talked. The doors opened immediately, and Yamra concluded that he needed to head to the second floor. The man standing in front of the young man asked if he was Yamra, to which he nodded. The man greeted him, extended his hand, and introduced himself as Soon. He was the head of the second department and would be responsible for the protagonist's test. Yamra shook his hand and said it was a pleasure to meet him. Soon smiled and replied that the feeling was mutual, adding that it had been a long time since they had tested an isolationist. The young man looked at him and asked if that was true. The head replied that about 10 years ago, there had been an increase in the number of isolationists, but little by little, the Korean government had regained control of most of the territory and those cases began to decline. He laughed and commented that the North didn't stand a chance before and now even less. Yamra looked at him, puzzled, not understanding which North he was talking about. They approached a door and Soon explained that the test would be conducted there and that, depending on the protagonist's class, he would be referred for training. The man opened the doors and ordered him to follow with a smug smile. He handed a paper to a girl and announced that he had brought the test subject, while Yamra noticed the spheres that Sunti had mentioned. The girl led the young man to the spheres and instructed him to place both hands on them, remaining still until the test was over. The protagonist carefully positioned his hands, and the girl announced that she would begin the exam. Shortly after activation, Yamra realized he truly felt no electric shock as his body resisted perfectly. He remembered what Sunti had said, that the greater the resistance to the shock, the higher the recorded level. Carefully observing the spheres, he concluded he needed to suppress his internal energy. An intense magical flow began to emanate from the spheres. After some time, the girl pressed a button to turn off the device and informed him that he could remove his hands. She announced that Yamra's result was F. The protagonist, concerned, asked what that meant. The girl explained that Class F indicated that he was awakened, with abilities slightly above those of an average person, while individuals without abilities were classified as G, according to scientific classification. Suryan thought that since Yamra was an isolationist, he probably expected to get a high class and was therefore very disappointed with a result only slightly above normal. Yamra let out a heavy sigh and reflected that he had made a mistake by trying to lower his resistance just enough to reach Class G. He realized he should have lowered his resistance to 0 from the start. Suryan called the young man with tears in his eyes. He cried and shouted for Yamra not to worry, because his class didn't define his worth as a person. The protagonist, confused, wondered why the department head was so distraught. Korean Association of the Awakened, Internal Security Agency, Department of Support for the Awakened. This department dealt with matters of extreme importance and secrecy. Task forces were organized by numbers, with the first group handling the most highly classified matters and the others following in descending order. The leader of the second group was responsible for training the isolationists. This was a position of great responsibility, as high-level awakened individuals often emerged from among the isolationists. Thus, even if it interfered with the main duties, organizing their training was mandatory. One of the employees tapped his fingers repeatedly against the plastic. Yunho stood beside Suryan's desk and asked if he was working overtime again. The man, visibly confused, looked at his colleague and questioned what brought the busy head of the first group to him. Yunho patted his shoulder and replied that he had heard about the signed order to organize the isolationists' training and came to invite him for a late-night meal. He looked at his colleague kindly and asked how the test had gone. Suryan ran a hand over his face and replied that he could see for himself, since that was the first isolationist tested in years. He added that the administration hadn't said anything, but it was clear they were dissatisfied with the result. On the monitor, he opened the protagonist's file, where the F rank was recorded. "Is it really an F?" Yunho asked. Suryan replied that things like that happened. "What a shame," said Yunho, observing the screen, while his colleague agreed, adding that the young man would face difficulties due to the isolation he had lived through. For him, it would have been better if he had ended up in the higher class. Suddenly, he lifted his head sharply and with a smile on his face, said he wouldn't mind eating kimbap or anything else to satisfy his hunger, based on what he heard. Upon hearing that, Yunho angrily squeezed his colleague's shoulder, causing him to ask, startled, what was wrong. With a heavy smile, Yunho asked if he had really come there in the middle of the night. Without warning, he put him in a headlock and shouted that he'd have to eat cold convenience store kimbap, adding that there was only fresh jjamyeon and gabeji. Subian screamed in despair, saying they just needed to make do, no need for jjamyeon. Make do. His colleague roared furiously at that response. Then he yelled with all his might that Suyen should never dare underestimate the importance of refined cuisine. Some time passed. The protagonist opened his eyes and immediately sat up in bed. The clock read 5:50 a.m. Imru looked at the time and commented that his friends in the spring pavilion must already be awake. He got up and put on his slippers. Stretching his arms, he reflected that it was strange not to feel well rested. Maybe it was because he had learned so much the day before. Looking ahead, he murmured to himself that there had also been pleasant moments yesterday. The previous night, after the afternoon training during dinner, he had been sitting at the table, and in front of him was an incredibly delicious roll. Coming out of his memories, he touched his chin and remarked that after jajangmyeon, that was the only dish that had surprised him so much, adding that he thought he had already tasted every possible dish in his past life. Scratching his neck, he said he needed to do something about the fatigue, concluding that he should practice chi breathing. However, thoughtfully, he touched his chin and pondered that he couldn't do it there since people in the building would quickly realize he wasn't an F class. He remembered Manhwa and said that woman almost discovered him when he went to eat jajangmyeon. The association building was full of awakened of different classes, and among them could be people with a much sharper sense of aura than that woman. He had to be careful. After thinking it over, he sat on the bed and said he was surprised by all the fuss around his training. He closed his eyes and commented that, in fact, the training was much more meaningful and useful than he had imagined. The previous night in the classroom, Suyen was holding a book while projecting the image of a portal, explaining that an S-class portal had suddenly opened, from which hordes of monsters began to emerge, causing great suffering for both civilians and the awakened. This event became known as the Great Conflict. Humanity managed to defeat the monsters, but the area where the war took place became uninhabitable. Since then, it had been called the Land of Death. Malian criminals tried to hide there. The protagonist listened carefully to the instructor while reflecting. When he exited the portal, he had landed in the Land of Death and only later found the city. Imru touched his chin and thoughtfully said that if even 2 or 3 portals of that level were to open and curse the land, the association wouldn't be able to handle the situation, which would result in disaster. He commented that he had only discovered yesterday how the country's society was structured and concluded that it resembled a tower made of poorly fitted pieces. If his understanding was correct, even a slight tremor could topple that tower. He, a martial artist of extremely high level, had appeared at this very critical moment. Looking around, Imru said it was almost impossible for him to live a peaceful and unnoticed life. Clenching his fist, he declared that even if it was selfish, he wanted to live the rest of his life in peace at any cost, so he couldn't let anyone discover his true class. Suddenly, he looked forward with a serious expression. Through the wall, he saw a man with incredibly pure energy approaching. It was Soon. The chief reached the door and knocked lightly, asking if Imru was already awake, to which the protagonist shouted for him to come in. Opening the door, Soon stepped inside. The protagonist, sitting on the bed, looked up and noticed that the chief looked extremely tired. Soon scratched his neck, uncomfortable, and asked if it was true. Yeom poured hot water from the coffee machine and opened a packet of instant coffee. He pointed to the coffee machine and told the chief to have some. Soon replied that he was pleasantly surprised by the boy because he had learned only the day before and was already practicing making coffee the next day. The protagonist turned with a smile, holding a mug of coffee in his hand. He handed it to the chief and said it was all thanks to his teaching. The man thanked him for the drink and took a sip. His body immediately lit up, and he asked what kind of coffee that was because it felt like he had just had a deep sleep and woken up refreshed. Yeom took a sip of his own coffee and thought that Soon was dedicating himself to teaching him, so he decided to give him some coffee and thanks, which gave him energy. He immediately asked the chief what they would be learning today, to which Soon raised one index finger and replied that the first lesson was on the topic of the cafeteria. The protagonist looked ahead and thought the cafeteria was interesting. Soon turned to him, then laughed and said he had requested a special menu. He asked if they were going and the protagonist nodded. When they arrived at the location, the chief commented that it was quite busy in the morning, after which Yamra thoughtfully said it reminded him of a military field kitchen. The chief laughed and replied that the work was a bit like war, so the boy wasn't far from the truth, but unlike field conditions, the portions were large. They grabbed trays and the man told the boy to take as much as he wanted. The protagonist, excited, asked what would happen if those who arrived late for breakfast didn't have enough food later. Soon turned to him and said he was very considerate of others, but there was no need to worry, as if some dishes ran out, the cafeteria staff would prepare more. The protagonist picked up a ladle and said that was incredible, and the chief went on to say that they were living in an age of abundance after all the wars. They served themselves food, and Yamra said that an age of abundance was good, but what surprised him most was something else. He sat in a chair and commented that it was the speed of logistics and the incredible technology for preserving and storing food over long periods. Soon thought that the boy was an isolationist and that despite his first training day being just dress yesterday, he was already thinking so strategically, which was amazing. He laughed and said it was all thanks to the scientists. He added that thanks to them, a great variety of products was constantly available, and that for office workers, a cafeteria was a place of rest and recovery. The protagonist agreed that meals were probably always the most enjoyable part of the day, after which the chief sighed and said he rarely went to the cafeteria, as he usually settled for a quick meal. After a while, they were in the elevator, and the chief asked the boy if he liked the food, to which he nodded and said he liked it very much. Soon said that was great, and that he had given him a tour of the cafeteria, so that was probably enough for today. Yahello was disappointed and said he thought there would be more classes, then asked if that was possible. Soon sighed and said the boy couldn't be fooled, as a visit about the topic of the gym was still scheduled. He smiled and said it wasn't really necessary for the protagonist's lesson, so he suggested they skip it, adding that being in the F class wasn't so bad since there were fewer responsibilities. He turned away from the boy and clenched his fist, thinking that he was cutting classes short because his main work was on hold and he was fooling a naive isolationist who still didn't understand anything. The elevator doors immediately opened. The chief pointed forward and said there was a gym in front of them, and anyone with an awakened idea had the right to train there. He added that this could happen regardless of class. Soon opened his hand to the side and explained that any awakened person could use that gym, and only criminal imposters would be prohibited from entering. The protagonist looked at those who were training and replied that he understood. The man looked at the newcomer and said that if he wanted to train there, that was fine. No, Yahello replied firmly, adding that he would be fine. Soon was very surprised to hear that. He looked at the student and said that it was all free, and that he could explain to him how the gym could be useful. The protagonist looked at the people in the hall and said he was grateful for their diligence, but didn't think he needed training for anything. The man looked at the boy with surprise and confusion, and asked what his plans were for the future. Upon hearing such a question, Yahello smiled. Well, he said, some time passed and he left the building. Not far away, he saw Sunti and Soyun. He approached them and thanked them for coming to meet him, and Sunti replied that it was nothing, then asked what class he was in. The protagonist then handed over his hunter license and replied. Upon hearing this, Soyun put her hand on her face and said he wanted to get a class gi like a regular person. Yahello put away the license and explained that he couldn't contain his inner energy, and over time ended up obtaining a higher class than he wanted. Sunti approached him and said that wasn't a bad thing, because his abilities were impossible to ignore and a regular person couldn't have them, as that would draw attention. Then the protagonist asked if he was really that suspicious, to which she replied that yes, people from the company were watching him all the time. Well, that's it. Soyun concluded the story. Jinho was beside him and asked if he had noticed anything else unusual about him. Then his colleague opened his hands and said that he had incredible intelligence and an impressive learning ability. He then remembered how Yahello had offered him coffee and said that, to be more precise, he was very smart, and if you explained a concept to him, he would immediately understand how to apply it in different areas. He learned fast and applied what he learned well. Upon hearing that, Jinho placed his hand on his chin and said thoughtfully that the law enforcement department, the first group, told him something even more interesting. They said his movements and sense of balance were not typical for his class. He looked at his colleague intently and said that they even doubted whether the test machine was broken. Upon hearing that, Soyun scratched her cheek in confusion and said that after the test, the machine was rechecked and there was nothing wrong with it. So he was sure his class had been assigned fairly. Then he extended his hand and said he wouldn't argue. Everyone can evolve to the next level, but he would never rise to the middle level, let alone to the upper class, and then ask if everyone was paying so much attention to him because they hadn't had isolationists in years. Jinho placed his hand on his chin and said that frankly he had expected more from him, so he was disappointed. He then asked what his plans were for the future. Soon remembered his student and said that he wanted to help his friend with a restaurant business. Sometime later at the Spring Pavilion, there was a phone in front of the protagonist. Sunti handed him the phone and said he could contact him anytime with it. Yahello thanked his friend. Sunti sat beside him and said there was no need to thank him, as he had bought the device with his isolationist allowance, and then asked if he wanted anything else. His wife sat next to him on the couch and asked if the boy had any desires. The protagonist looked at his hair and said he was thinking about getting a haircut, adding that he hadn't noticed before, but had recently realized that most men in his civilization had short hair, so he didn't want to stand out. Upon hearing this, Soyun clapped her hands happily and said it was a wonderful idea, and asked what kind of cut he wanted, adding that short hair would suit him very well. Her husband scratched his cheek in confusion and said it was true, adding that any hairstyle would suit their friend. Suddenly, he remembered he needed to chop ingredients for the next day. Sunti turned, walking toward the kitchen, and thought that when his wife starts talking about fashion, it's like turning off the lights, and thought he believed in the protagonist. Soyun, with a smile on her face and shining eyes, told Yahello to come with her, as she would take him to the hairdresser. After a while near the hair salon, Sunti said his haircut was so noticeable it could be seen from a kilometer away, after which the protagonist replied that Soyun helped him a lot. The man felt a strange sensation, as if the whole street was looking at Yahello. They walked down the street and people were commenting that the protagonist had the appearance of a model that everyone admired. An unknown girl ran up to him and asked for an autograph and a photo together, and another girl made the same request. Sunti, smiling, extended his hand forward and apologized to the girls. Worried, he said Yeomro wasn't a star, just a regular guy, so there was no need to ask for autographs. The girl was surprised and said that such a handsome guy didn't look like any actor from today. The man sighed heavily and approached the boy, saying the girls were simply crazy, after which the protagonist wondered why he couldn't take a photo with them and why they needed his autograph. Sunti explained that Yeomro was so handsome he was being mistaken for a celebrity, and that if they let the girls take a photo with him, they would immediately post the pictures online. He said that if people started sharing photos of the boy, he would be recognized on the street, which would only bring problems, and asked if that was the life Yeomro wanted. The protagonist looked at him with fear and replied that it was true. He thought he needed to be careful, as it wasn't good to stand out in a crowd like that. The next day, the waiter shouted that 2 servings of jjajangmyeon were ready. There were many people in the cafe talking to each other. The waiter wished the girls a good meal, which immediately excited them, and they thanked him. Yeomro walked through the cafe, holding a menu in his hands, when he suddenly noticed a table with people. He approached the table and asked if the girl had already decided on her order. The girl immediately began to cry and shouted for him to bring 2 jjajangmyeon and a seafood udon. He smiled and asked the girl to wait, then called out the order and the cook took it. 2 tables immediately ordered gabaju from the first and third tables. The people in the cafe were excited and enjoying the food. The girl tried the food and said that the cafe's cuisine was simply excellent. She said she would come back every day to eat jjajangmyeon. The manager smiled, thanked the girl, and asked her to come back often. Another girl called her from the side and asked if there were any seats available. The receptionist smiled awkwardly and said they were completely full, to which the girl was disappointed and said she really wanted to eat at that cafe. She immediately closed her hand into a fist and shouted that she would wait, when suddenly another girl in line shouted that she would wait too. Sweet drops appeared on the receptionist's face, who said the food in the kitchen was almost gone, so it would be better to come back the next day. With tears in their eyes, the girls in line said they really couldn't eat at that place. Suddenly, a woman's voice was heard shouting from the crowd, asking for space. The receptionist looked toward the hallway between people. The girl raised her hand, greeted the receptionist, and introduced herself as Kim Jae-yeon, saying she had come for an interview. Kim Jae-yeon, with her hand extended, said she had come for an interview. Seo-yoon approached her and said she was happy to see her. She placed a hand on her chest, introduced herself, and added that she was 23 years old, had graduated from college, and was looking for a job in her field. Seo-yoon led her to the restaurant, saying that they had been short-staffed lately, so they decided to hire another part-time worker. The girl stepped in and said that the Spring Pavilion was a very famous restaurant and that she wanted to work there. Seo-yoon blushed at those words and asked if it was really that famous. Yes, Kim Jae-yeon replied, looking at the protagonist and adding that the handsome guy had attracted the entire female population. Yeomro looked at his future co-worker and was very surprised. Their eyes met, and the protagonist thought to himself that she was very interesting, as she had an extremely strong aura. He realized that in that civilization, people with great superpowers lived well. They were supposed to be valued and have a different quality of life compared to ordinary people. Kim Jae-yeon was very confused by the eye contact with a guy like him. Seo-yoon led her to the kitchen and asked if she could package the pickled radishes for now, adding that she still needed to make deliveries and take down orders. The girl exclaimed excitedly that she understood everything. Seo-yoon then approached the protagonist and asked him to deliver everything according to the list. The protagonist prepared all the dishes for delivery. He put on his helmet and said he was heading out for deliveries. Kim Jae-yeon turned and smiled, saying, "Ok." At that moment, Sun-T placed the finished dish on the table and asked the new employee to help package the portions. During the break, Kim Jae-yeon observed the customers and commented that when she heard about this place, she was told there weren't many customers. Suddenly, the protagonist appeared behind her and asked if she was busy. Kim Jae-yeon turned around surprised and asked if he had already completed all the deliveries. Yeomro stood beside her and confirmed, adding that all the addresses were pretty close. Kim Jae-yeon placed another order box on the table and said he could take it since all the dishes were already packed. The protagonist took the delivery and said he was heading out. Kim Jae-yeon waved at him and told him to be careful. Outside, the rain began to fall. In just a few minutes, it turned into a real downpour. Yeomro entered the restaurant and said he was done. Sun-T looked at him and told him to sit down, saying he had already delivered everything for lunchtime. The protagonist approached the table and asked if they were already getting ready for the evening rush, to which Seo-yoon answered affirmatively, before suddenly remembering it was time to pick up Hae-yeon from kindergarten. Kim Jae-yeon heard that, approached the hostess and asked if they really had a daughter. Seo-yoon looked at the employee and confirmed, adding that the girl was 5 years old. Then she looked at the protagonist and asked if he could pick Hae-yeon up from kindergarten, as the evening rush was beginning and they barely had time to prepare. Sure, Yeomro replied firmly, saying he would help and be right back. Kim Jae-yeon suddenly scratched her cheek and turned to the woman confused. She crossed her arms and with a slight blush on her face said she also wanted to meet Hae-yeon, then asked if she could go along with the protagonist. Seo-yoon's husband winked at her and she understood the situation. After that, she said it was fine, they could go together. Kim Jae-yeon was very happy and said they would be back soon. They walked down the road under umbrellas. The girl placed her hand on her chest and introduced herself, saying she was 23. Yeomro looked ahead and said he was 35, but that she could call him whatever she liked. Upon hearing that, that, the girl exclaimed in surprise that he didn't look 35 at all. Yeom turned to look at her and said that for some reason, many people said that. Then he modestly asked why she chose to work at the Spring Pavilion, since with her abilities, she could look for a less common job. Kim Jae-yeon turned her gaze away from the guy and said she didn't have any abilities. She raised her hand in front of her and asked the protagonist not to think she had any ulterior motives, as she only wanted to observe him. She didn't finish the sentence and suddenly screamed loudly, pointing at the door where someone was standing. She asked if that was Ha-yeon. The teacher told the girl to say hello to her uncle, and Ha-yeon immediately began waving excitedly, smiling. Yeom asked if she had fun, and the girl nodded her head. The teacher looked at him and said proudly that Ha-yeon had talked a lot about him and that she was very curious about the girl's amazing uncle. She immediately looked forward, her eyes widening in surprise. Yeom asked if she was okay, to which the woman blushed and shouted loudly, apologizing. Then she turned to Kim Jae-yeon and asked if she was the protagonist's wife. Yeom watched the teacher recognize Kim Jae-yeon and asked if it was really her. The woman wanted to know how the girl had ended up there, but Kim Jae-yeon covered the teacher's mouth with her hand, cutting her off and shouting if she really worked there. Sora asked how Kim Jae-yeon's guild was doing, but the girl begged her not to spread that around. Kim Jae-yeon looked at Ha-yeon and explained that her parents considered her an ordinary person. She said she was on a mission and asked Sora to pretend she didn't know her, to which Sora agreed and replied that she understood everything. Sora waved to Ha-yeon and said goodbye until the next day. The protagonist turned to the teacher and said it was time to go. They went down the stairs, walking in the rain. Yeom looked at Kim Jae-yeon and asked if the kindergarten teacher was her friend. The girl laughed awkwardly and confirmed. The guy commented that he had noticed they were friends and wondered why they didn't talk. Kim Jae-yeon blushed and said they saw each other so often that they ended up avoiding conversation, then laughed out loud. She looked at Ha-yeon and said that walking in the rain with an umbrella was very pleasant. The girl nodded excitedly and asked if beautiful Kim Jae-yeon also liked walking in the rain. The girl smiled and said she liked walking with the girl's uncle even more. Ha-yeon in turn said she liked the umbrella because it had little ducks drawn on it. The protagonist looked at Ha-yeon and asked if the umbrella wasn't too heavy for her to carry. The girl smiled and assured him it wasn't heavy, so she could carry it by herself. Happily, she walked ahead, and Yeom said that if she needed help, she should just say so. As they walked, they passed an alley where a soaked animal was standing. Ha-yeon stopped, pointed, and said there was something there. She ran toward the alley, shouting for her uncle to look. As she got closer, the girl saw a rat on the ground and shouted that it was squeaking. Yeom picked up the small animal and asked why it was getting wet in the rain. Kim Jae-yeon approached, looked closely, and said it wasn't an ordinary rat. She explained that it was a dungeon rat. The protagonist asked if it was a magical creature, but Kim Jae-yeon replied that it wasn't. She said that unlike magical beasts, the dungeon rat didn't feel hostility toward humans and didn't try to hurt them. This type of rat had a sharp sense for detecting natural enemies such as magical beasts and monsters. Thanks to this ability and its cute appearance, it had become popular among hunters, who often tamed them. Kim Jae-yeon suspected the rat had followed its owner into a portal and that something bad had happened. Wounded, it had managed to escape. Ha-yeon looked at the rat with sadness and cried out that she didn't want it to die. She asked if they couldn't heal it. The protagonist replied that it wouldn't be easy to save it. With tears in her eyes, the girl said that if it was still breathing, they shouldn't abandon it. Those words deeply moved Yeom. He remembered when he had been kneeling among lifeless bodies and realized how blind he had been. He thought the rat would die anyway, even if it was still breathing. However, after reflecting, he concluded that all life was valuable. Yeom questioned how he could be different from his former self, the cold-blooded killer he once was. Coming out of his thoughts, he looked at the sad Ha-yeon. After a brief pause, he closed his eyes and said he would take the rat with him. Kim Jae-yeon smiled at the girl and said they needed to run to the restaurant and try to save it. The protagonist warned that the rat was in serious condition and breathing with difficulty, so they needed to act quickly. Ha-yeon became frightened and asked what they should do. The protagonist, observing the small trembling animal, noticed that its breathing and heartbeat were weak as if it were fading away. He placed 2 fingers on the rat and channeled magical energy, asking himself if he could bring life back to it. Kim Jae-yeon watched the scene in surprise, a bead of cold sweat running down her face. After some time, they all returned to the restaurant and the girl ran immediately into her parents' arms. The mother looked at her daughter and asked what had happened and why she was crying. Ha-yeon cried out for help. The protagonist held out the injured rat, surprising the girl's parents. Sun-tae stepped forward, recognizing the animal as a dungeon rat, and asked where they had found it. Yeom replied that they had found it near the portal. The man pointed to the animal and said it looked like it had been attacked inside a nearby portal, as it was breathing with difficulty. Ha-yeon spread her arms and shouted that she would save it and take care of it. Ha-yeon's mother, sitting next to her daughter, explained with a warm smile that it wasn't a hamster, but a dungeon rat. She said that since they had found it on the street and not inside the portal, it probably had an owner who must must be worried. The protagonist looked at the rat and stated that the most important thing was to heal it first. Sumtae agreed and suggested finding a nearby veterinary clinic. Suddenly, the restaurant door opened. Yunho and Myeonjin entered and greeted everyone. Sumtae invited them to sit and asked if they had come to eat. Yunho spotted the dungeon rat and approached, asking if it was the one he thought. Sumtae confirmed that his daughter had found it on the street and that it was injured. Yunho placed a hand on his chin and examined the animal, saying the situation was serious. Myeonjin asked for permission to examine it. He picked up the rat and stated that the initial care had been very well done as the animal was in better condition than it seemed. Yunho explained that the rat had come out of its critical state and that he would just add a bit of his energy. The protagonist watched Yunho, realizing that the young man was absorbing energy from the environment and transforming it into healing power. He concluded that Yunho must be a healer. The rat began squeaking and Hayen looked at it with eyes sparkling with joy. Beck placed a hand on Yunho's shoulder and said he was their famous healer. Hayen jumped with excitement, shouting that he was amazing. Yunho handed the rat to the girl and asked if she really thought so, to which she nodded and thanked him. Beck commented that the girl was lucky and Yunho agreed. The protagonist watched the scene and thought that this was the true power of the awakened, something truly incredible. Sumtae approached Haeyeon and asked what she was doing. The girl replied that she was taking care of the rat, which seemed to be better. A few seconds later, she shouted that the rat had moved. The father asked if it was true. Haeyeon placed a bowl of milk for the rat, saying it must be hungry. Sumtae smiled and commented that if the rat was eating, it was time for Haeyeon to wash her hands and have dinner. The rat drank the milk and looked ahead. Suddenly, it began banging its head on the table. The protagonist, confused, asked what was wrong with the rat, concluding that it wanted to say something. The animal began jumping around the room, squeaking loudly to get the young man's attention. Suntat entered the room and asked what was happening. Yamra replied that the rat was trying to guide him somewhere. Suntat, hand on his chin, commented that the animal was smart but found it strange that it didn't have an owner, suggesting that something bad must have happened. The man looked at the protagonist and asked if he should follow the rat to investigate. Yamra hesitated for a moment, but Sunta said they couldn't ignore the rat as Haeyeon would be sad. The girl with clenched fists smiled at Yamra. The protagonist smiled and replied that he would do it for the girl, but he was also cautious about something. He turned to the rat and said he saw a strange energy around it. Sumtae looked at the animal and said he didn't understand the guy, while Imru replied that he had seen such energy before, but still didn't know what it was. He asked the rat if it knew where to go, to which it squeaked. He picked it up and said he would go with it. Suntag and Haeyeon anointed him one last time and wished him luck. As they left, the animal began shivering from the cold, squeaking loudly. The protagonist saw a flow of aura ahead and asked if that was where they were headed. Running, he approached. He looked up and said it looked like the portal from which he had come to this world. The portal illuminated the street intensely, and the protagonist shouted that this was definitely the portal. Screams and squeaks were heard inside the portal. A horde of monsters was approaching the Awakened, who had come to clear that dungeon. One of them waved his hand and shouted if they were really going to die there. His comrade defended himself with a shield and yelled that there were too many monsters, to which the guy shouted that there were only 4 left. The girl holding up her staff was trembling all over and said she would soon run out of strength and wouldn't be able to maintain the barrier. The guy heard that, looked at the number of monsters around and said this was truly the end, adding that he was happy to have had the chance to work with them. His comrade smiled and thanked him for everything, then suggested throwing a party in the afterlife, to which the guy with a scar on his shoulder sarcastically replied that he already had enough of that in this life. The girl held the staff with her last strength and thought to herself that only an S-rank hunter could save them, but that was just a distant dream. After those thoughts, the glow of her staff faded. Suddenly, the squeak of a dungeon rat was heard behind them. The guys heard it and were very surprised. Suddenly, the green blood of the monsters splashed everywhere. The skeletons were shattered in the blink of an eye. The mage, with tears in her eyes, summoned a faint light. Her companion shouted in shock, asking if all the monsters had been killed. There were many skeletons scattered around them, reduced to bones. Then the Awakened started looking around, asking what had just happened, as they had been surrounded, and suddenly everything changed. Then the girl looked at the others and asked if they had heard the squeak of Kekarongus. At that moment, the protagonist dashed in to destroy the monsters with his incredible technique. He channeled magical power into his hand, which glowed brightly. With one strike, he destroyed all the monsters in his path. There were many dead bodies and pools of green blood around him. Yamra then remembered that last time he hadn't killed all the monsters in the portal. Some small ones remained alive, so the portal didn't close. Coming out of his memories, he said firmly that this time he would finish the job. As he said this, a monster appeared behind him. The protagonist immediately sensed it. He quickly turned and sliced the monster in half. Yamra cut part of the zombie's head and saw something glowing glowing inside it. Then he realized it was their core, meaning he needed to strike the head. A horde of monsters started crawling toward him. Yahello suddenly saw a sword and ran toward it with incredible speed, saying he would borrow it. He grabbed the weapon in his hands and firmly said he would avenge its owner. The zombies and skeletons charged to attack. Many fast strikes were heard in the darkness. A few minutes later, many fully dead corpses lay on the ground. The protagonist stood before great doors from which a terrifying demonic energy emanated. He approached and placed his hands on them. With some effort, he opened them and entered, from where he heard an angry voice asking who he was. A huge headless knight stood before him, furiously asking how he dared disturb his peace. The boss stomped on the ground and shouted that he would not allow this to happen to anyone. He brandished his weapon and yelled that people like him were meant to be killed. He slashed forward as Yahello managed to dodge and was surprised to see the knight holding his own head in his hand. The knight was surprised by the boy's words, and the boy added that he had quite a unique look. The boss's eyes glowed with rage and he shouted that the protagonist would pay for his mockery. He struck the ground and leaped into the air. He pointed his spear at Yahello and dove down, shouting loudly that he would kill him in a single blow. The protagonist was surrounded by mana and raised his hand, asking if the boss's weakness was his head. The knight frowned and looked at the boy in confusion. Yahello lifted his head, staring at the boss, and began to move his arms, leaving a magical trail in the air. The knight roared, calling the boy insolent. The boy launched a beam of magic at the enemy and pierced him. The knight, after a loud scream, dissolved into the air, leaving behind purple mana, and a glowing stone dropped from him. It fell at the protagonist's feet, and he asked what it was. He picked up the stone and thought that it was probably the source of that energy, and this must be what they called magic stones in this world. The stone began to shine brightly and emit blue mana. The rat in the boy's pocket peeked out and began to squeak. It climbed onto the protagonist's shoulder, and the boy said he had eliminated everything that posed a threat. The rat jumped into his hand, and the boy said that the portal would soon close, so the animal needed to run back to its owner. He placed the rat on the ground and told it to take care. The rat quickly ran ahead, squeaking loudly. Yahello crossed his arms over his chest and said that Han would clearly be upset. The rat ran anxiously forward. Voices were heard ahead saying that the dungeon was strange. The men in suits said that the dungeon had been classified as C-class for some reason. One boy said he thought they were done, but still couldn't understand what had saved them, to which another guy asked if it was possible that an S-class hunter had saved them. The boy replied that all the S-class hunters he had seen radiated incredible power, and if one had shown up in the dungeon, they would have felt it immediately. The boy said it was possible it was the Zero-class awakened they had heard about, and the girl thoughtfully replied that anything was possible. She turned to the side and said there had definitely been a Kekarani squeak there. The rat began running in a panic, squeaking loudly. The guys wondered if it was really looking for someone in the dungeon. Tears welled up in the girl's eyes, and she said the rat was looking for Han. The boy turned to the side, looking at the bloodied corpse, and said that the boy was dead. Korani ran to the body and squeaked in alarm. She stood on her hind legs and reached her front paws toward the boy. She squeaked in frustration. Korani turned to the others and pressed her little paws against herself, trembling in fear. The girl looked ahead and asked what was happening, to which the boy replied that the portal was empty. He said it would soon close, so they needed to quickly collect as many magic stones as possible and meet at the exit in exactly 20 minutes. He stretched his hand forward, and they all ran in different directions. People behind the portal shouted that a special forces team was exiting, so they needed to carry a stretcher quickly. Korangi ran past the people, frustrated, while Juzu's voice was heard, making a report for the hunting news. People began to shout, asking how many had been killed in total. There were white clouds in the blue sky. It started to rain out, sitting in the rain, squeaked softly, smiling. She lowered her head, crying tears of sorrow and incredible. Heian was sitting in her room, very sad. Her father approached and said it would be better that way, and to its owner. The girl replied that she knew that. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she said sadly that she wouldn't see it again. She was upset. The house door opened, and the protagonist entered. He saw Heian looking sad and asked why she was sad, as if someone had died. Sunti looked at his friend and replied that he had never said goodbye to that rat. What rat? Yahello asked. Right after that, Kurami came out of his pocket. Heian heard the squeak and immediately turned around. The girl immediately ran to hug the rat, while the protagonist turned to Sunti and said that the name of the dungeon rat was Kurangi. He raised his finger and said it seemed like the owner had taken her on a mission to clear monsters, and they both got hurt. Upon hearing this, the man asked what was wrong with him, a drop of cold sweat on his face. Then Yahello said he had found him dead, adding that nothing could be done since so much time had passed since his death. Suddenly, Sunti realized and asked in shock if the guy had actually entered the dungeon. The protagonist crossed his arms and replied that he had. Sunti pointed his finger upward and said the portal would probably be cleared soon, to which Yahello replied that he had already cleared it and it had closed. What? The man shouted in shock. Then he remembered how he used to work as a porter. In his mind, he wondered what class the protagonist actually was. Maybe something like the legendary hunter Lishan. He remembered the shock in his eyes when he saw the awakened one. He had the chance to talk to hunters when he worked as a porter. Aside from the incomparable hunter Lishan, no one could enter a portal and clear it alone. But Yomra didn't emit an aura nearly as powerful as his. Lishan emitted a terribly insane magical energy. If the protagonist was just hiding his aura that well, he must be one of those zero-class awakened everyone was talking about. His thoughts were interrupted by his daughter. She tied a ribbon on the rat and asked everyone to look. Her father replied that she looked like a princess. After that, he looked at the protagonist, smiled, and said in his mind that there was nothing to worry about, adding that he was his friend, so it didn't matter if he might be a zero-class awakened. It was already late at night outside, and Sunti was still wondering in his mind. Nothing bad would come of it, adding that he would think positively. He, Sunti, and Yamra decided to keep the dungeon wrap for themselves, so Soyun scolded them. The next day, the protagonist woke up. He looked at the calendar and said it was a day off, but what should he do today? Train or look for a job for a few hours. Suddenly, he remembered how, in his homeworld, a girl used to scold him for always working and not knowing how to rest. She snatched the rope from his hands and shouted, asking why it was so hard for him to just rest, to just do what he wanted, because it was stupid to work when he should be resting. Leaving the memories behind, Yamra smiled and said she would say the same thing to him now. He held his knee and wondered whether he should look at the magic stone. The protagonist looked at it and said in his mind that it was an invisible and alien energy. People in this civilization used the energy from these stones. Their energy was similar to the black magic used by the cult followers of the celestial demon. That magic was forbidden in the magical community. This energy was obtained through human sacrifice. The protagonist let go of the memories and picked up the magic stone in his hand, saying in his mind that he couldn't keep such a dangerous object, so he would seal its energy for now. After these thoughts, he left the room and found Sunti, who said he was up early. The protagonist asked if Sunti was really going to spend the whole day off chopping ingredients, to which the man laughed and said he had to be responsible and at least chop onions for tomorrow. And for the guy, this was his first day off, so gasped what he wanted to do. Yelmer crossed his arms and said he was still thinking. Sunti looked at him with a smile and asked if he could go to the library with Hyan. The protagonist looked at him in confusion. After a while, Yamra approached the building with Hyan in his arms. The guy asked if there were really places where anyone could read valuable tomes. The girl replied that she wanted to look at the books, so the guy began to set her down and told her not to run and to come back as soon as she chose. The protagonist moved the chair and thought everything there was convenient, and there were an incredible number of books. Hyan went to the bookshelf and reached for a book. An unknown guy approached and asked if she needed help. Hyan pointed upward and asked him to get the book. The guy quickly grabbed the book and handed it to the girl, who immediately thanked him. The protagonist turned and watched the girl. He looked at the guy's aura and thought that he was also awakened, as he had a pretty strong aura for his age. The stranger let out a heavy sigh, and Yamra thought that he didn't know what was going on in the guy's life, but it was clear that it wasn't easy for him. The protagonist kept observing and concluded that the guy wasn't as strong as Yunsei but had skills. Then he wondered why he was still in such a low position. Hyan looked at the guy with interest and asked if he was feeling bad, to which the young man, surprised, asked if it was that obvious. The girl replied yes, because even her uncle was worried about him. The boy turned to Yamra and asked why. The young man opened his mouth and shouted that her uncle was the delivery guy from the spring pavilion. The protagonist approached them and asked if the young man knew him. The guy reached out his hand and replied that Yamra was very popular on social media, that women liked him, and that he made deliveries in an instant, even though he was a foot courier. The young man asked if he could know the protagonist's class. Yamra replied that he was class F, and the guy shouted in shock. Sometime later, they were sitting at a table, and the guy said that was how he lived. The protagonist brought a hand to his chin and realized that raids were only allowed from a certain age, so they had to find a way to survive. The young man placed his hand on the back of his neck uncomfortably and said that's why he accepted any job offered to him and also work as a library volunteer, as he received a scholarship bonus. Yamra looked at him and asked if there really wasn't anyone who could help a guy with such abilities. The young man replied that his class was C, which was neither good nor bad, so no one would sponsor him. He looked at Yamra and said he had no special skills, that he was useless, and his mother lived in poverty. The protagonist raised his hand and said that class didn't decide everything in life, then asked if the boy wanted to raise his class. The young man opened his mouth in surprise and shouted that it was impossible. He asked, incredulous, who said that, to which Yamra replied that the boy was giving up without even trying, then asked if he didn't want to become stronger. The young man clenched his fists and shouted that of course he wanted to, but didn't know how. The protagonist interlaced his fingers and said he could teach him, raising his index finger. He said that in return return, he wanted the boy to find information about a country. The young man asked which country he was talking about. Yammer replied that he needed to know about the Oak Dynasty. The guy picked up a book and said it was the first time he had heard of such a state, but added that he would try to find information about it. The protagonist thought that if he had traveled through time, then there should be information about the Oak Dynasty period in history. He concluded that this would logically explain why the magic of that dynasty and the magic of this time were so similar, even if they were called by different names. The boy started flipping through the book and reading everything about the period. The protagonist asked what happened. The boy replied, confused, that he had researched all the ancient dynasties. He looked at Sirius and Miyamura and added that there was no such thing as an Oak Kingdom dynasty. The young man closed the book and said that such a dynasty had never existed. The protagonist opened the book and thought that all the names of the dynasties were similar to those of their civilization, but he had never heard of them either. With a drop of cold sweat on his face, he told himself that this meant that among the kingdoms of the past, there had never been a period of the Oak Dynasty on this land. The young man noticed his discomfort and asked if he was okay. Yammer stepped back and said he was just thinking. Then he looked at the young man and thanked him for his help, inviting him to the spring pavilion where he would treat him to Jazzingman. The young man looked confused and replied that he didn't need anything in return. After leaving the table, the protagonist reflected that he hadn't obtained the information he was hoping for, but one thing was clear: he hadn't traveled through time, nor had he been bewitched by the mages of the celestial demon sect. So how had he gotten there? That same night at the spring pavilion, Yamura was sitting in his room, meditating. He remembered when he was a child and his father handed him a relic from his great-grandfather. The boy looked at the object in surprise, not understanding its meaning, while the man simply patted him on the head. Coming out of those memories, Yamura opened his eyes. He asked himself what a strange memory that was and concluded that there was no need to rush, as everything would become clear one day. As he thought about this, he heard a strange sound coming from outside. Curious, he wondered what was lurking around the restaurant. Outside, a chubby guy was peeking around the door of the spring pavilion. He pulled a wrench out of his pocket and crouched beside Sun-T's motorcycle, muttering that he would loosen some parts a bit to discourage the owner from riding it again. A shadow appeared behind him as he said he was only following Sanak's orders, so it wasn't his fault. Yomra, standing behind the man, asked who Sanak was. The guy screamed in fright, fell to the ground, and asked who he was. Yomra looked at him calmly and said it wasn't right to scream at that hour of the night, asking him to keep it down. The man stood up, still shocked, and again asked who he was. The protagonist replied calmly that he was just a deliveryman from the spring pavilion. The man sneered, saying it was good that he was a rookie, because Sanak was planning to make an offer to the restaurant owner, so he should look for another job. Yamra asked why. The man pointed at him and said that Sanak made a lot of money in the area and was tired of the spring pavilion's success. With disdain in his voice, Yamra replied that that was ridiculous. The man, irritated, asked if he was crazy to be so arrogant and tried to throw a punch. Yamra calmly watched the blow and caught the man's fist with one hand. Cold sweat covered the thug's body. He screamed internally, wondering how a mere deliveryman could be so strong. Yamra said it would be good for him to come to his senses. Then Yamra placed his fingers on the man's forehead and gave him a light flick. The force was so terrifying that the man flew backward and bounced across the ground like a skipping stone. Yamra put his hands behind his back and told him to warn that idiot Sanak not to mess with the spring pavilion. The man, terrified, grabbed his cap and ran away. Elsewhere, Sanak was leaning against a wall, holding his phone. Gritting his teeth, he asked why the man hadn't called yet. Suddenly, a guy came running toward him, shouting that Dongman had returned and needed to be seen. The guy was helping Dongman, who wore a cap and could barely stand. Sanak approached and with disdain said he had given Dongman a chance, but he had failed again, since all he had to do was loosen some parts of the bike, and now he came back defeated. Dongman fell to his knees and desperately cried out for Sanak to listen to him. Panicking, he said that the new deliveryman from the spring pavilion was not an ordinary person, but a monster, and that if they tried anything against the restaurant, he wouldn't let them get away with it. Sanak frowned and, annoyed, shouted that no wonder Dongman got his ass kicked. Dongman shouted loudly that the guy really was a true monster. Sanak said that, let's say, Yamra was strong, but they would go together to teach him a lesson, as it was time to warm up. He looked at his phone and said they needed to gather everyone and go see the deliveryman. The protagonist was carrying 2 food bags in his hands. He placed them on the ground and set them in front of the guys holding a bat. Yamra picked up the food and raised his head, asking where he could pick up the plates afterward. The guy approached him and shouted if the protagonist still hadn't understood anything. He clenched his fists and said with a grin that he'd have to work with them, since they said Yamra had beaten up Dongman. He kicked the deliveryman's bag and shouted that the guy had really pissed Sanak off. The protagonist stood in front of them and looked behind, asking if that was Dongman. Yamra walked up to him and Dongman screamed in fear that he had already told everything to the guys. Another guy turned the protagonist toward him and, gritting his teeth, asked what he was mumbling. He reached for the deliveryman's helmet helmet and shouted menacingly for him to take it off. The protagonist frowned and looked at him angrily. He grabbed the thug by the arm and said that it wasn't wise for a weakling to speak like that to someone stronger. The guy began to squirm in fear and screamed for Yamra to let him go. The protagonist twisted his arm and said that Dongman should have passed the warning on to them. The guy's face turned blue from pain and he screamed, looking at his own hand. The protagonist was surrounded by mana and said he'd have to teach the guys a good lesson. Sometime later, he entered the restaurant and said he was back. Santi said he was a little late and asked who had placed the order so early. Was it the thugs? After a brief silence, Yamra replied that people simply enjoy eating. He added that the guys liked it so much they even washed the dishes. Santi looked at him and asked in shock if they had really washed the dishes. He picked up a plate and saw that it was sparkling. The protagonist said he wanted to ask something. He asked if the man knew someone named Sanak and what his attitude was toward him. A drop of sweat appeared on Santi's face, who asked Yamra how he knew about Sanak. He said the guy had been a delivery man before the protagonist, always lazy and constantly asking for a raise. Yamra crossed his arms and said there had been a conflict and one of the customers was someone he knew. He added that they had behaved inappropriately, so he had to give them a little lesson. Santi looked at him in horror and thought Yamra was so strong he must have given them a much bigger lesson. Some time ago, the protagonist held one of the bandits' hands tightly, making him scream in pain. His companion waved his hand and ordered the others to capture him. Yamra released the bandit's hand. Then he waved his hand and released an incredibly powerful magical energy against the opponents. It was a powerful gust of wind that knocked down all the bandits. Daman sat on the ground looking at the hand that was being squeezed with all his strength. But while he was distracted, the protagonist stood right above him. The fat man crawled backward, tears in his eyes, and said they would be in trouble if they went any further. Yamra extended 2 fingers, enveloped in his power. He struck Benchel with them, who begged for mercy and ordered him to repeat it out loud. He started saying that he would never do it again. Benchel, with tears in his eyes, began to repeat. The protagonist withdrew his hands and continued, saying that he wouldn't plot evil against the owners of the Pavilion of Spring. The man screamed the same words in horror. Once he finished speaking, Yamra withdrew his hand and Benchel fell to the ground, crying bitterly. After that, the protagonist stood up and said that he understood that besides this guy, they still had a leader. Daman put Benchel over himself and fearfully asked if he was talking about Sanak. He then said that the boss was watching from the side but really didn't know where exactly. At that moment, Sanak was sitting near the barrels, thinking that he needed to leave quickly. Thinking about this, he started to run, but the protagonist immediately noticed him. Sanak ran into an alley trying to hide. He turned around and asked himself if it was true that they wouldn't be able to catch him now. Suddenly, Yamra appeared in front of him and asked if he had only managed to run this far. The man became very scared and shouted that he had frightened him. Then he pointed a finger at him and shouted, asking who he was and why he was attacking people over a harmless prank. He was a bandit, so he would call the police. The protagonist took a step forward and said that the man appeared in the middle of the night to sabotage the motorcycle and asked what other pranks he had in mind. Sanak raised his fist and shouted, asking what would happen if he did that to him. Yamra extended his hand and said that diseased branches should be cut off before they infected the whole tree. The shadow of the protagonist's hand appeared on Sanak's face, and in horror, he ordered him to not come closer. The next second, a loud scream echoed throughout the city. Santi was sitting at the table, peeling onions. Suddenly, he received a message. He picked up the phone and saw a message from Sanak, apologizing. The protagonist approached the table and asked if Sanak had sent a message. The man looked up and responded, saying yes, adding that he had said he would stop being so strange, go back to his village and work on the farm. Then he raised his hands and asked, surprised, how he managed to create that goat, to which Yamra replied that he simply spoke with him. In his mind, he thought that even though he was a goat, Sanak had been part of the Pavilion of Spring team, so he was happy that he had come to his senses. Yunsi entered the restaurant and greeted everyone. Santi greeted her and apologized for calling her on her day off. Yunsi smiled and said that she had no plans for the day anyway. Santi scratched his head and said that they were short on people, as his wife and Hyan had gone to an event at the kindergarten, and Yamra added that today was the day for planting trees. The girl smiled and said that her younger brother would also be planting trees today as an act of charity. The protagonist asked if her brother liked volunteering, to which the girl smiled, confused, and replied that he was just very kind, and then laughed. She shouted that they needed to start working, but thought the protagonist annoyed her because he was always asking uncomfortable questions. After a while, they sat at the table, chatting pleasantly. Santi said that Hyan and Soyeon would probably have fun as it was unusual not to have anyone at home, which made him feel even a little lonely. Yamra sighed and said that new portals had opened in the mountains lately, and he hoped his companions were safe. Yancy raised her index finger and said that the Hunters Association guaranteed the safety of the festival, so he didn't need to worry. She added that the Rastash at kindergarten was also under the association's supervision and strong hunters had been sent to work there, to which Sunti responded that her words reassured him. He smiled and asked how Yunsi knew about this since he had worked as a porter at the association for a long time, but didn't know that information. The girl shouted loudly and the guys looked at her confused. Yunsi winked at them and said it was a secret, so she couldn't tell. The day was bright outside and the road was busy with cars. The boy with pink hair sighed heavily and said that he couldn't enjoy his day off with the pleasant weather anymore. So why had they called him today? He waved his hand and said that Yunsi should have attended the event. Moyen adjusted her glasses and said that the young lady had urgent matters to take care of and asked them to send the least useful person to the event. She added that it was easy to guess that Yunsi was talking about the young master. The boy clicked his tongue and sighed, saying that he couldn't believe it. Moyen said that she hoped the young master knew that he was going to the event for a reason. The boy looked at her in confusion and the girl explained that a certain important person would be at the event. She added that this person was influential in the association, and this was the boy's chance to impress him. She was talking about the only S-class artifact creator in the entire country, Xiaoqiu. The boy looked out the window with displeasure and asked if he was really going only to impress him. Moyen said that the master was in a business meeting and asked if the boy hadn't read the additional materials she had sent. The boy turned to her, shouting loudly, asking what materials these were. The girl said that if he kept acting like this, she would be forced to tell everything to the young lady, and the boy shouted at her not to tell Yunsi anything. The boy said the girl would kill him, and not in a figurative sense. Moyen adjusted her glasses and asked him not to exaggerate. She said that the boy needed to make a good impression on Xiaoqiu. She added that meeting a zero-level awakened person was as important as establishing a connection with the famous artifact master. Moyen started pushing the boy's shoulder, forcing him to move forward, and shouted that they had arrived, so they should greet Xiaoqiu quickly. The boy looked at her worried and said that he could simply approach him. He walked up to Xiaoqiu from behind and coughed into his fist. The boy greeted him and introduced himself as Hone from the Red Dragon Guild, saying that his father had spoken highly of the master. The old man turned to the boy and asked if he was Hichu's son. The boy extended his hand and said he was, and it was an honor to meet Xiaoqiu. The old man said it was a pleasure to meet him, but if that was all, he should be kind enough to enjoy the event, pointing ahead. He turned and told Hone not to interrupt his conversation with his grandson. The boy thought the rumors were true since the old man was quite cruel. Xiaoqiu's grandson ran to Hone and bowed, apologizing as the master was not always prepared for such situations. Moyen found Hone and said she didn't expect anything different from him. The boy said Yunsi knew everything, so why had they sent him? He was upset, asking where his sister had gone on such an important day, putting all the responsibilities on her younger brother. Moyen said that the girl had gone out with her idol. Some time ago, the protagonist carefully carved a wooden rabbit. While doing so, he asked Tian if she was sad because she didn't have a rabbit-shaped spoon. After finishing, he handed the little rabbit to the girl and said that now she would have one. The girl took the sculpture and was very happy. At that moment, Tian was looking at the ground with tears in her eyes. Her spoon-shaped rabbit had broken into 2 pieces. The other children were confused and asked what they should do. Suddenly, Tian looked up and cried bitterly. Her friend raised her fist and angrily said that she had warned them to be careful with the spoon. Xiaoqiu heard the shouts and paid attention. Shin cried loudly, saying that her uncle had made that rabbit for her, but now it was broken. The old man approached her and asked if she wanted her grandfather to fix the spoon. Chan looked at him and asked if he could really do it, to which the old man replied, of course. He took the spoon and the broken piece of the rabbit and said that a grandfather could do anything. After saying this, he looked at the carved rabbit. He was very surprised by the skilled work and wondered what kind of craftsman had made it. At that moment, a servant appeared behind him and said he had brought his scroll. The old man turned to him and asked Yunsik to come closer to look at the product. He showed the sculpture to the servant and asked if any of his students could make such detailed work, to which Yunsik replied that it would be difficult to replicate such a piece. The old man looked at Chien and said that her uncle loved her very much, to which the girl replied, happily, that she also loved her uncle. Then Xiaoqiu put the 2 parts together and said that her uncle had worked hard, so he would fix the rabbit. As he joined the pieces, he blew on the rabbit, and they fused together. Afterward, he handed the spatula to the girl and said everything was ready. Chien was very happy and thanked her grandfather. Hone was watching this. He crossed his arms over his chest and said that this craftsman wouldn't fall for anything, he needed an approach. Suddenly, his eyes lit up because he had an idea. He looked at the servants and said he had come up with a plan, then instructed them to inform the assistant team that they were changing their strategy regarding Master Xiaoqiu. The girl bowed and said it would be done. Lately, the protagonist had gotten into the habit of going straight to the bakery when he received his isolation allowance to buy a delicious bun, which he first tasted during training at the association. He opened the door, greeted the owner, and asked if there were still any buns left. The owner greeted the young man cheerfully, and Rue walked around the room observing. He then approached the owner and asked if the buns had already been sold, to which the owner replied that they had all been sold long ago. Suddenly, the owner grabbed one and said with a smile that he had saved one especially for him. The protagonist extended his hand and said that the owner always helped him, and for that he was grateful. The owner handed him a box with the bun and said that if he didn't eat it all today, he should remember to put it in the fridge. The protagonist went to the exit, thanking the owner. As he opened the door, he saw a girl and let her go first. She immediately went to the counter and and the owner looked very embarrassed, saying that the weather was great today. The protagonist watched them from the corner of his eye before leaving. After a while, the protagonist was home. He opened the fridge and placed the bun inside. Kurangi was sitting on his lap, drooling as she looked at the food. Yammer gently poked the rat's nose and said that she had already eaten her part of the bun, and if she wanted, they could eat more together for breakfast tomorrow. At night, the protagonist was lying on his back and Kurangi was sound asleep beside him. She heard a strange sound and moved her ears. She got out of bed and left the room, opening the door slightly. As she opened the fridge, she jumped onto the shelf with the dessert. As she approached, she put her paw in her mouth in sadness because she didn't find the bun. The protagonist immediately approached her from behind and called her. Kurangi turned to the young man and squeaked loudly. Sun smiled and asked if Squeaky really ate the entire bun by herself. Yammer replied that she denied everything, but it was obvious who the culprit was. The restaurant door opened and a man stood up from the table. He looked forward and asked if it was Heck. The old man entered the restaurant and saw Yammer with them. Sun looked at Heck and asked what had brought him there. Heck smiled, handed over the bag, and said he had come to get a beer, to which Sun smiled and said he shouldn't have bought the beer, and then asked who wanted the bun. Heck said he had a serious conversation with Sun, so he brought a sort of bribe with him. Sun took the bag and asked what had happened since the man's face was pale. Heck started nervously messing with his fingers and asked how Sun had confessed his love to his wife. He said that the girl who frequented his bakery was very beautiful and kind, and that he had been in love with her for 3 months. He sighed heavily and said he didn't know what to do, and that if he confessed his love to her, he was afraid Missy would start avoiding him. Yammer told Hayek to stop brooding over these thoughts or he would get sick soon. Hayek started crying and asked how a brood like him could ask such a wonderful girl out. Sun shouted and asked why he was worrying about this, as it didn't matter. Hayek started banging his head on the table and crying, while Sun asked what to do with him now, then said the man should go home and sleep there. Yammer said Hayek could sleep in his room and Sun asked if that wouldn't be an inconvenience. The protagonist smiled and said he always kept a place for him. After some time, Yammer took Hayek to the room and laid him down on the bed. Kurangi opened one eye and looked to the side. The protagonist turned in the same direction and asked what had happened. The rat started jumping anxiously, and the young man asked what was wrong with him. The fridge door was slightly open. The protagonist approached and opened the door. There was a fairy eating food inside the fridge, and Yammer shouted, asking threateningly what she was doing there. The fairy turned in surprise to the young man covered in buns. It was already morning. The protagonist was sitting at the table with everyone, where the fairy stood asking if it was really her who ate his roll cake. The fairy shyly looked away and said her name was Dosen and apologized for doing something bad. Sun was very surprised and asked how a flower fairy ended up in their kitchen, as they were usually attracted to flowers or honey. Then Hayek pointed a finger and said it was probably the honey from the bread that attracted her. The protagonist looked at the guys and asked what a flower fairy was. Sun explained that fairies were humanoid spirits that lived in portals. With the emergence of the portals, they started settling in their cities. Magical monsters were exterminated, but no one touched the fairies since they didn't harm people and sometimes even helped. Thus, they settled in the protected cities. Upon hearing this, Yammer extended his hand and asked if they were creatures like Squeaker. Sun smiled widely and replied yes, but sometimes there were annoying fairies, although they still weren't a serious threat. After these words, Yammer looked at the fairy, who was very upset with displeasure. He crossed his arms and said that this time he would forgive her, but told her not to steal from anyone again. The fairy was very scared, raised her hands, and said she knew that she was ashamed that she worked and wanted to eat. Hearing this, Sun placed his hand on his chin and asked if she really wanted to work for them. His wife put her hand on her face and asked how a flower fairy could help in a Chinese restaurant. Then Heck looked at the protagonist and said she could be useful to him. Stunt looked at his friend and said it seemed like they were shifting a responsibility onto him. Yammer smiled and asked if he could train her, and in exchange, he would hire the fairy. Seo Yoon imagined the man's dry and handsome body and exclaimed happily that he had thought well, because a man in good shape certainly wins women's hearts. Hayek scratched his cheek, confused, and asked to be taught, as he had neglected his appearance for a long time, which left him lacking confidence. Hearing this, the protagonist said he would finally have someone to train with. Hayek raised his fists and said happily that it was time to start. After a while, Yamra, Seo Yoon, and Yoon Si went to the supermarket. The protagonist looked at the woman and asked why they had gone there, adding that she asked not to tell Sun and Haeon. Then Seo Yoon said that her husband's birthday was the day after tomorrow. Yoon Si clapped happily and said it was the boss's birthday, and Yamra calmly said that now everything made sense. The woman crossed her arms and said, confused, that she wanted to buy a gift for him but wasn't sure what to give. Yoon Si took her hand and said cheerfully not to worry, as she would help. At the same time, she thought she had never imagined a situation like this, even with friends. It was something wonderful. She also looked at the protagonist and thought that it was also like shopping with Yamra, and although she was the hostess with them, it still felt like they were on a date. Suein also looked at the protagonist and asked him not to tell her husband anything, adding that they would hide the gifts in his room. Yamra firmly responded that she understood everything. Then she asked what gift she wanted to give her husband. Suein placed her hand on her face and said, confused, that she was thinking of buying shoes for him, but wasn't sure if he would wear them. Then Yoon Si raised her finger sugar and suggested buying vitamins or supplements as the boss had been very tired lately. The woman was very happy and said it was a good idea, adding that she knew the girl was better at picking gifts. After that, the girls went to pick everything they needed, while the protagonist stood aside. He averted his gaze and saw the girls whispering while looking at him. Then he approached them and asked if he could leave now. Upon hearing this, Yoonsi raised her hands and said no. She put glasses on the man's face and said people wouldn't see how handsome he was. They continued picking gifts. Yoonsi went to the window and pointed at a large teddy bear, saying that Han would certainly like it, to which Yamra agreed. Suddenly, he felt the aura of another person awakening. A loud scream of pain was heard. There were loud screams from the store asking customers to stay in their places, and people were shouting that there were illegals in the store. The protagonist asked who they were, and Yoonsi replied that they were the awakened who used their powers to make money. The security guards pointed their weapons at the thief, and Yamra thought that not all awakened had the same aura color, as the strange person had a blue aura. He thought the illegal must not know that the security had activated a barrier around the mall, and no one could pass through it except for those who set it up. The protagonist asked why they would commit a crime knowing that, and maybe they had some other plan. The girl replied that it could be a distraction, and they could investigate other targets. Yomra closed his eyes and asked if there were magical stones stored in the building's basement. Yoonsi replied that a mall that big probably had many A-class stones. The girl started waving her arms in different directions and said that the security was controlling everything and that they would resolve the situation. Soo-yoon looked at her phone worriedly and said they were now going to be late to pick Haeyoung up from kindergarten. The girl was sitting at the kindergarten, upset, and the protagonist thought that he had no choice, so he could help the security. He told Yoonsi to stay with Soo-yoon and, pointing to the side, added that he needed to go to the bathroom for a moment. The girl looked at him and said to be careful. Yeomra quickly ran to the side. He went behind the wall and saw bodies, asking what happened. He placed his hands on them and thought that he had given first aid and saved them from death, but they were all in critical condition. The man walked down the hallway and looked into an open room. A man with a sword was pointing his finger at people, ordering them to move. Yeomra looked at him and felt his aura alone, wondering what to do. He immediately entered the room, closing the door behind him. He quickly ran between the people who were at the computers. He stood over the bodies and thought there was no one to interrogate, but he would still find out, by the rumors, what had happened. Lifting his head, he said he would leave the rest to the associations. The girl turned to the people and yelled threateningly that the people in black clothes were just a distraction so they could steal the stones. She turned to Ussie and asked her to stop those involved in the store robbery. She jumped and ordered the two guys to jump behind her to the basement. The three began running quickly. Holding a knife in her hand, the girl leaned against the wall, trying to make no sound. She turned abruptly, looking at the office, and shouted loudly for them not to move. She looked at the bodies on the ground and asked what happened there, then wondered who could deal with all the robbers. The protagonist stood in front of Sunti and said it was his birthday and that he was busy with work. The man yawned and asked what was special about birthdays, saying that he was born on that day and that was it. Yammer said that it wasn't an ordinary day for anyone. Haeyoung and Soo-yoon entered the room happily with a cake and began wishing him a happy birthday. The girl raised her hands high and cheered happily, wishing her father a happy birthday. Haeyoung entered the restaurant asking if he was late, and Yoonsi immediately ran inside happy. Tears appeared in Sunny's eyes and his wife asked him to blow out the candles quickly. After a while, it was already dark outside, but only the lights were on in the restaurant. A few days passed and Sunti said that today was a holiday. The protagonist was peeling onions and asked if it was Children's Day. The man turned around and said yes, and since it was a day off, they would earn a lot of money today. Yeomra quickly peeled an onion and said that he had read that this day was dedicated to children, and then mentioned that Haeyoung was also a child. Sunti approached the table and said that was true, so he would go see an illusion show with her after lunch. After saying this, he placed his hand on his chin and thought aloud that they would be busy until lunch, but what would they do if Yoonsi wasn't there today? The protagonist extended his hand and said that's why he had called in a substitute. As soon as he said that, the restaurant door opened. A young man entered and greeted everyone. Sunti looked at him and asked if he could present a custody consent certificate and a medical certificate. The young man immediately provided everything that was necessary. Then the man pointed to the pile of dirty dishes and asked the young man to wash his hands first and then wash the dishes. The young man quickly completed the task and Sunt praised him, saying that he worked very fast and it was evident that he was awake. The protagonist looked at the boy and said it wasn't easy, since he delivered newspapers every day and learned that way. After saying this, he lowered his head and said that even when someone is awake, all skills need to be trained. The man asked, surprised. He raised his head to look at the boy and wondered why then Yoonsi. He observed the young man cleaning the tables and asked what the G-class of an awakened person would be, much faster than this C-class boy. Meanwhile, Yoonsi was sitting in the car, car. Her subordinate with glasses was sitting in the back seat, saying that they would arrive soon. She waved her finger in different directions and said that as soon as they got out, Yoonsi should greet the president first and then the president of the association, and then she needed to talk to other artists and guild directors. The girl replied that she understood everything and asked about her father. The subordinate replied that he had promised to make a quick visit. Yoonsi placed her hand in her purse and said he must be very busy. She took out a lipstick and opened it. Shaking the cap, she said that today was Children's Day and asked why she had to be at the corporate party today and why she had to wear this dark and flashy makeup and a red suit. The servant turned around and said that the red color symbolized their Red Dragon Guild, so they needed to be patient, adding that the guild should be an example for children to follow and an object of aspiration. While Yoonsi applied the lipstick, she asked what aspirations and what example, since they could barely deal with each new portal, and now they were talking about this. She then looked at a small mirror and said that, however, this country owed them its well-being and security, and their world was constantly balancing on the edge of the abyss. The girl with glasses said she shouldn't forget her status, that she was the most beautiful and representative face of the guild, the Red Flame Witch. Hearing this, Yoonsi became very tense, and the lipstick smeared down her cheek. The girl with glasses took a napkin and said it was natural for a person awakened from a good high-class family to be as beautiful as her, so there was no reason to be ashamed of it. Yoonsi wiped off the lipstick and thought to herself that she simply wanted to look older to avoid being neglected because of her age, but now this flashy makeup had become part of her image. The girl with glasses looked at the lady sideways and asked how her hobby of pretending to be a low-class person was going. Hearing this, Yoonsi became very confused, waved her hand, and shouted that she was working undercover to protect civilians in case of an emergency. The girl heard the lady, took a piece of paper, and said it was because she had a favorite pastime, an escape valve besides work and guild matters. A few minutes later, their car stopped. Woyan got out of the car and opened the door for Yoonsi. The girl got out of the car and smiled, thinking that it had been a long time since she was in her hunter role. The protagonist was holding Hyun's arm and walking through the mall. A young man who was walking alongside them noticed an interesting mission. He called Yeomra and pointed to the side. The protagonist turned around and realized the young man was pointing at the dark game. He stepped back in fear, thinking that assassins were training in broad daylight, and Haeyoung told him it was just a game. Yeomra thought that these were the same types of entertainment games that the people of this civilization loved, and then the young man told him that points were awarded for each balloon popped. The girl pointed ahead and said the big prize was a teddy bear. There was a large bear on the shelf, wrapped in a package. Yeomra knelt down and asked Haeyoung if she really wanted that toy, to which the girl smiled and happily replied that if she had a teddy bear like that, she would be very happy and didn't want any more candy. The protagonist asked what she thought of chocolates. The girl put her hands to her mouth and thought for a moment. She shouted that she also wanted to eat all the delicious things and chocolates as well. Yeomra turned to the young man and asked if he could try, as this would make him a friend of Haeyoung. The young man, timidly scratching the back of his head, said he would be happy to try, but he was a non-awakened person with a rather useless explosion skill. He said he wasn't very strong for a C class, as he could only cause a small explosion, enough to briefly blind and distract a monster. He exhaled in confusion and added that this ability was useless in everyday life. The protagonist replied that there was nothing to worry about and that he should try to do what was asked. He approached the game and asked the man for 3 darts. Yeomra took the darts and handed them to the young man. The young man took them and asked, confused, how he could hit the ball for 100 points with 3 darts. Yeomra told him to stand firm and tense his core muscles, because if he was unstable while throwing, the dart's center of gravity would shift. He added that his shoulders and wrists should be relaxed, and when aiming, he needed to aim a little higher. He said that the last piece of advice was to concentrate. The young man threw the dart at the target and shouted loudly. He immediately hit the ball for 100 points. The young man began jumping with joy and shouting that he had hit it. Haeyoung grabbed the big bear and hugged it happily. The announcer announced that the Great Magician's show was about to start and asked the audience to take their seats. The girl looked at her uncle and shouted that the illusion was starting, so they needed to run. The protagonist turned around and smiled. The girl ran and Yeomra asked her to be careful, as she might fall. The men in black masks were holding bags in their hands, and one of them asked if they were putting themselves in danger, to which the other shouted that when the command came from above, it wouldn't have a choice. The young man said threateningly that they themselves would be killed if they didn't kill all those people. The other young man asked in fear what would happen if they were captured. His friend shouted for him not to be afraid and then raised his hand with a ring on his finger lighting up, saying that even if powerful awakened people were looking for them, they still wouldn't find them. The young man exhaled and asked if their only goal was really the blood flower. They pointed their weapons forward, and the young man told his friend to look for the target. The boy thought that she must be called the blood flower. He aimed in Yoonsi's direction and thought it was her, the Scarlet Flame Witch, and that she needed to die. Hey everyone, did you enjoy this story? I really liked it. If you want to follow the next part, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you in the next story, guys.